In 1936, a worker near Baghdad uncovered a clay jar from the soil. It was small, unremarkable, roughly the size of a fist, sealed at one end with bitumen, lined on the inside with a copper cylinder, and fitted at its center with an iron rod. Archaeologists catalogued it, gave it a shelf number, moved on. It sat in a museum in Iraq for years before anyone thought to ask the question that changes everything. What would happen if you filled it with an acidic liquid? The answer, in when scientists finally tried it, was electricity. Somewhere between 1 and 2 volts of electricity produced by an artifact 2,000 years old, built by hands that, according to every textbook ever printed, had no business knowing how. History, as most of us absorbed it, follows a clean and reassuring line. Primitive people first, then agriculture, then writing, then bronze, then iron, then the slow march upward toward the world we recognize today. That line makes sense. It feels stable. It gives the past a shape that is easy to hold. And then you find the Baghdad battery, and the line begins to wobble. Not collapse, not yet, just wobble. The way a table wobbles when you set something unexpectedly heavy at one corner, and you realize the surface you trusted was never as level as it appeared. Set aside that jar for a moment and look wider. Around the same time that artifact was being filed away, a Greek sponge diver brought up a corroded bronze lump from the bottom of the Aegean Sea. Nobody understood what it was for decades. When they finally examined it properly, when they applied X-ray imaging to its ruined surface, they found dozens of interlocking gears of extraordinary precision, encoding astronomical data, calendar systems, eclipse predictions. A computer, in every meaningful sense of the word, built 14 centuries before anything comparable would appear again in history. You open a manuscript from the Vedic tradition of ancient India, translated from Sanskrit that is at minimum 3,500 years old, and you will find detailed descriptions of flying vehicles, their construction, their propulsion systems, the metals used in their bodies. Not metaphor, specifications. Travel to a cave in France, in the Dordogne Valley, where the walls are painted with figures that archaeologists have dated to more than 30,000 years ago. Most of the figures are animals, mammoth, bison, horse. But in one corner, a single shape stands apart, upright, enclosed in a rounded form that fits the head and shoulders, wearing something that does not belong in any natural world. This documentary will not ask you to believe anything. That is not its purpose, and it would be an insult to your intelligence to try. What it will do is something simpler and considerably more unsettling. It will show you what exists, physically, verifiably, sitting in museums and carved into rock faces and encoded in published scientific literature. And it will ask one question. If history is the story of humanity's long climb toward knowledge, then what do we do with the evidence that the climb was interrupted, that something or someone placed knowledge at the top of the ladder before the ladder was built? The Baghdad battery was not an accident. It was a beginning, and what it begins has been waiting, patient and unhurried, out for someone to ask the right question. Mainstream history gives us a timeline. Writing emerged in Mesopotamia around 3,200 BCE. Metallurgy began in earnest roughly 5,000 years ago. The wheel arrived in Mesopotamia around 3,500 BCE. These are anchor points, dates and places that organize the story of human progress into something legible. They are taught in schools, they appear in textbooks used in universities on every continent. And they are, in the most uncomfortable way imaginable, incomplete. Because sitting alongside each of these milestones, filed in the footnotes of academic journals rather than the main text, is a growing list of objects and discoveries that the timeline cannot accommodate. For writing, consider the Indus Valley script. It predates what we were told was the beginning of written language by a meaningful margin, and it has never been deciphered. Not for lack of effort, linguists and cryptographers have been attempting to decode it for over a century, and it simply refuses to yield, as though the knowledge required to read it has been removed from the earth entirely. For metallurgy, iron objects have been recovered from Egyptian tombs that predate the official start of the Iron Age by thousands of years. Not rust-stained fragments, worked iron, shaped with intent, entombed beside bodies that were buried long before the civilization is supposed to have known what iron was. And then there is engineering. At multiple points across the ancient world, Egypt, Bolivia, Turkey, Peru, Malta, structures survive that the tools of their era had no business producing. Stones weighing hundreds of tons, cut to tolerances that modern diamond-tipped blades struggle to replicate, placed in positions that modern cranes could only achieve with millimeter-level guidance systems. The official explanation for these structures, ramps, manpower, ingenuity, is not wrong exactly. The ramps and manpower can move large stones. What ramps and manpower cannot explain is the precision, the right angles. The interlocking fits so tight that a knife blade cannot be inserted between surfaces. The repeatability of measurements across sites separated by thousands of miles and centuries of time. These objects have a name in specialist circles: out-of-place artifacts, OO parts. The term is almost aggressively neutral and designed to describe without judging objects that exist in contexts where, according to the accepted historical model, they should not exist. They are not hidden, they are in museums. The Delhi iron pillar, 7 meters tall, 6 tons of 98% pure wrought iron, rust-free after 1,600 monsoon seasons, stands in the courtyard of the Qutb Mina complex in India, accessible to any visitor. The Baghdad battery is in the Iraq Museum. The ANTIKYTHERA mechanism is in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. These are not fringe discoveries circulating on the internet. They are documented, catalogued, and quietly unexplained. What mainstream academia tends to do with OO parts is not deny them. It is something more sophisticated than denial. It files them. It categorizes each one separately, assigns it a localized explanation that addresses its specific features without connecting it to any other anomaly, and moves on. The Delhi pillar was the result of exceptional ancient craftsmanship. The ANTIKYTHERA mechanism was a remarkable but isolated achievement. The Baghdad battery may have been used for electroplating. Each explanation is plausible in isolation, but when you stop treating each artifact as an island and begin looking at the archipelago they form together, a different picture emerges, one that the accepted historical model has never been asked to explain as a whole. This documentary is asking that question, and the answer, whichever form it takes, will not be comfortable. There are structures on this planet that no engineering team alive today can fully explain. There are texts written 4,000 years ago that describe aircraft and surgical instruments in language so precise that engineers have built working models from them. There are people, ordinary, credentialed, skeptical people, who have reported stepping out of the ordinary flow of time and into a moment that did not belong to them. Each of these things is documented. None of them, taken alone, settles anything. Taken together, across 10 chapters and 10 different categories of evidence, they form something that is very difficult to look away from. The rules of this documentary are simple. Nothing will be asserted without evidence. Nothing will be dismissed without examination. Where mainstream scholarship has a good answer, that answer will be given its full hearing. Where it does not, the silence will be held for exactly as long as it takes for the audience to feel its weight. This is not a collection of conspiracy theories dressed in polite language. It is an investigation, structured, cumulative, honest about what it knows, and careful about what it only suspects. By the time the final chapter arrives, 2 competing explanations will have been built in parallel, and each fed by the evidence of every chapter that preceded it. The first is that human civilization is far older than the accepted record suggests, that a sophisticated predecessor culture existed before the last great catastrophe, and that what we call ancient knowledge was not invented. It was inherited imperfectly from a world that ended before history had anyone to write it down. The second explanation is more radical, though in certain ways more elegant, that the source of anomalous ancient knowledge was not a lost civilization, that it was something or someone operating from a point in time that lies not behind us, but ahead, that the visitors the ancient world described were not gods, not aliens, but travelers, and that the time they traveled from was our future. One of those explanations, by the final chapter, will have become very difficult to dismiss. Not proven, the evidence does not yet exist for proof, and this documentary will not pretend otherwise, but suggested persistently across dozens of independent lines of evidence drawn from archaeology, physics, mythology, metallurgy, and documented human experience. What begins tonight with a clay jar in a Baghdad museum will end with a question that reaches forward into the future and backward into the deepest past simultaneously. The evidence will speak for itself, as it always has. The only thing that changes is whether anyone is listening. And the Parthian battery, known more commonly as the Baghdad battery, is not a large object. 14 centimeters tall, it could sit comfortably in the palm of your hand. A clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, bitumen stoppers at both ends. When Wilhelm König, an Austrian archaeologist working at the National Museum of Iraq, examined it in the late 1930s and identified it as a possible electrochemical cell, the scientific establishment responded with polite skepticism. Then, in the 1940s, researchers at the General Electric Research Laboratory built replicas and filled them with acidic solutions grape juice, vinegar, lemon juice, and measured the output. Between 1.5 and 2 volts, steady, consistent, repeatable. The Baghdad battery was not a theory, it was a fact. 3 explanations for its purpose have circulated since its discovery. The first, that it was a storage vessel for sacred scrolls, has largely been abandoned, since the internal structure is entirely wrong for document storage. The second is electroplating, the hypothesis that ancient craftsmen used these cells to deposit thin layers of gold onto silver surfaces, a technique that would explain the extraordinarily fine gold work found in the same region and era. Archaeological chemist Paul Craddock of the British Museum has noted that several ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian artifacts show evidence of electrochemical gilding that matches what the battery could produce. The third explanation is the most expansive, that the battery represents a surviving fragment of a broader electrical knowledge that once existed in the ancient world. The evidence for that third possibility arrives in a detail that most descriptions of the Baghdad battery omit. The artifact was not found alone. It was found in a group. Other similar devices were discovered at the same site. Some estimates place the number as high as 12. When researchers wired 10 replicas together in series, the combined output was sufficient to power a small light. Not a metaphor, a small light. The implications are significant. A single Baghdad battery could electroplate a ring, 10 wired together could run a device. 12 arranged correctly, it could constitute a rudimentary power station. What device those 12 jars may have been powering has never been identified, but the fact that they were built in multiples, not as curiosities, but as components, suggests that whoever built them understood exactly what they were doing. The deeper question is not how the battery worked. The deeper question is where that knowledge came from and where it went. 2,000 years passed between the manufacture of these jars and the moment Alessandro Volta described the electrochemical cell in 1800. In those 2,000 years, no document survived. No diagram was preserved. No oral tradition carried the principle forward into a civilization that might have developed it further. The knowledge appeared, produced its objects, and then vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving only a row of clay jars and a gap in history where an entire chapter of electrical science should have been. In 1901, sponge divers working off the coast of the Greek island of ANTIKYTHERA pulled from a Roman-era shipwreck what appeared to be a badly corroded lump of bronze. It was placed in storage at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens and largely ignored for decades and classified as an unremarkable piece of ship's cargo. Then, in the 1970s, researchers applied X-ray imaging to its surface. What they found inside changed the history of technology. At least 37 interlocking bronze gears of varying sizes and extraordinary precision, inscribed with astronomical data, calendar cycles, and predictive equations. The device could calculate the positions of the sun and moon, predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy, track the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games, and model the irregular orbit of the moon using a differential gear mechanism, a technology that Western engineering would not independently rediscover for another 14 centuries. The Antikythera mechanism is, by any reasonable definition, an analog computer, not a primitive precursor, not a rough approximation, a functional, sophisticated, precision-engineered computing device. See, built by hands operating in the 1st or 2nd century BCE, that would have been the envy of any European clockmaker, working 1400 years later. CT scanning carried out in the 2000s as part of a multi-university research project called the Antikythera Research Team revealed inscription text on the mechanism's interior surfaces, describing its operation in terms that matched modern astronomical calculations to a degree that continues to astonish researchers. One plate carried a parapegma, a written astronomical almanac, cross-reference to gear positions with an accuracy that implies not guesswork, but systematic, long-term observational astronomy of the highest order. The question that no academic has been able to answer definitively is not how the mechanism worked. We understand how it worked. The question is what happened to the civilization that produced it. The next known device on Earth of comparable mechanical complexity did not appear until the 14th century in medieval European clockmaking. That gap, 1,400 years, is not a small oversight in the historical record. It is a civilizational amnesia on a breathtaking scale. The knowledge required to build the Antikythera mechanism, the gear-cutting technology, the astronomical modeling, the mathematical framework, should have been the foundation of a continuous tradition of precision engineering. Instead, it vanished completely, without leaving a traceable descendant. And there is one further detail revealed by CT scanning that the research team noted with the particular restraint of scientists who understand the weight of what they are saying. The mechanism, as it survives, is incomplete. Portions of it are missing, not corroded away, but absent in a manner suggesting the surviving device is a fragment of a larger, more complex whole. The full machine, had it survived, would have been more sophisticated than what we have, more sophisticated than what we can currently fully decode. Somewhere at the bottom of the Aegean, the rest of the Antikythera mechanism is still lying in the dark, in the wreckage of a ship that was carrying something the ancient world understood, and the modern world is still catching up to. Inside the Hathor temple at Dendera in Upper Egypt, carved into stone walls approximately 2,000 years old, there is a series of bas-relief images that Egyptologists have categorized with varying degrees of comfort as religious symbolism. The carvings show large, bulb-like objects, wider at one end, tapering to a narrow point at the other, each supported at its base by a column that bears a striking resemblance to a jed pillar, itself one of ancient Egypt's most potent sacred symbols. Inside each bulb, a sinuous shape extends from base to tip. In isolation, the lotus and serpent interpretation that mainstream Egyptology prefers is defensible. Lotus flowers and serpents are ubiquitous in Egyptian sacred art. But isolation is not how evidence should be read. In the 1970s, Austrian electrical engineer Walter Gahn examined photographs of the Dendera carvings and observed something that stopped him cold. The shape of the elongated object, its proportions, the internal sinuous form, The way it is depicted in relation to its support structure matched, so with uncomfortable precision, the design of a Crookes tube, a high vacuum glass tube in which an electrical discharge produces a visible, luminescent glow. The sinuous shape inside the bulb corresponds to the arc of ionized gas that forms inside such a tube under electrical discharge. Gahn published his comparison. It was largely dismissed. The dismissal was not accompanied by a refutation of the visual correspondence. In it was simply noted that such technology could not have existed in ancient Egypt, which is technically a circular argument. The circumstantial architecture around the Dendera images is not easily brushed aside. The temple's inner sanctum, where the reliefs are located, has no windows. Its ceilings are painted in vivid color and extraordinary detail, work that required sustained, precise illumination to execute. And those painted ceilings contain no trace of soot. In the ancient world, the available light sources were fire-based, oil lamps, torches, candles. All of these produce soot, and soot accumulates on ceilings with remarkable efficiency. The absence of soot in enclosed painted spaces is to an engineer a more significant anomaly than any carving on any wall, because it is a physical record of a physical absence. Something was providing light in that chamber that did not produce combustion byproducts. A papyrus from the same period contains a phrase that translates in approximately as light that illuminates the sacred place without fire. Mainstream Egyptology reads this as poetic description of divine radiance. That reading is possible. It is also possible that the scribe was recording something they had actually seen. Taken together, the visual correspondence of the carvings, the zero-soot ceilings, the textual reference, and the nearby discovery of the Baghdad battery in the same ancient cultural sphere, the Dendera reliefs form a question that has not been honestly answered, not because the answer is unavailable, but because asking the question honestly requires entertaining the possibility that ancient Egypt was lit by something more sophisticated than a burning wick. In 1898, an Egyptian tomb at Saqqara yielded a small wooden object, 6 inches long, carved from sycamore. It was tagged by the Cairo Museum as a wooden bird figure and assigned a catalogue number. There it sat, undisturbed and unremarkable, for 71 years. Then, in 1969, a physician and archaeologist named Khalil Messiha noticed something the original cataloguers had apparently overlooked. Birds do not have vertical tail fins. Every bird on Earth, and every bird that has ever lived, has horizontal tail feathers. The Saqqara object had a perfectly vertical tail fin. When Messiha and colleagues built scaled replicas and tested them aerodynamically, the object demonstrated stable gliding flight. It was not symbolic. It was not decorative. It was aerodynamically functional. On the other side of the Atlantic, the Museo del Oro in Bogotá holds a collection of small gold figurines recovered from pre-Columbian burial sites in Colombia and Venezuela, dated between 500 and 800 CE. For most of the 20th century, they were categorized as zoomorphic jewelry, stylized representations of fish or insects worn as ornaments. In 1994, 2 German aviation experts, Algund Ehnbohm and Peter Belting, examined the figurines closely and identified features that do not appear in any known fish, insect, or bird. Swept back delta wings, a stabilizing fin positioned vertically at the rear, a cockpit-like undercarriage structure at the front. These are features of aircraft, not animals. Boom and Belting built scaled-up replicas at aircraft proportions and flew them successfully under radio control. No modifications were required. The aerodynamics were already correct. The implications of these two artifacts, separated by continents, cultures, and centuries, need to be stated plainly. They do not prove that ancient humans flew commercial aircraft. They do not establish a global aviation industry in antiquity. What they establish is that in at least two unconnected ancient cultures, someone had studied the principles of lift, drag, and controlled flight with sufficient precision to produce aerodynamically correct models. The Wright brothers achieved powered flight in 1903. The scientific understanding of lift that made their success possible. Bernoulli's principle, angle of attack, swept wing stability, was formally codified in the 19th century. Whoever made the Saqqara bird and the Colombian gold figurines was working from a conceptual framework for which no surviving textual record exists. There is a version of this story that does not require anything extraordinary. Gifted ancient artisans, observing birds in flight with exceptional attention, may have arrived at aerodynamically stable shapes through pure visual intuition. Intuition can produce accurate results, but intuition does not produce a vertical tail fin. Birds do not have vertical tail fins, so observation of birds will never produce one. A vertical stabilizer is an engineering solution to the problem of yaw, lateral rotation in a fixed-wing flying body. Arriving at it requires not observation of nature, but deduction from aerodynamic principles. Whoever made the Saqqara bird had solved a problem that human aviation would not formally solve for another 2,500 years. The question of how they knew to solve it has been filed in the same quiet drawer as the Baghdad battery and the ANTIKYTHERA mechanism. And that drawer is getting very full. The Great Pyramid of Giza has been examined, measured, argued over, and marveled at for more than 4,000 years. Its construction, logistics, have been debated endlessly. Its religious significance has been studied exhaustively, but there is a category of information embedded in the pyramid's dimensions that does not fit neatly into any religious or logistical narrative, and which the mainstream historical conversation has consistently declined to assemble in one place and examine as a whole. The pyramid's base is level to within 2.1 centimeters, across a span of 230 meters, a tolerance that modern laser-guided construction teams would consider an acceptable achievement, and its four cardinal sides are aligned to true north with a deviation of just 3/60ths of a single degree, more precisely than the Greenwich Observatory in London, which was built in 1675 with the explicit goal of celestial alignment. These two facts alone, the levelness and the orientation, suggest not ancient ingenuity, but ancient access to measurement technology of extraordinary precision. But the deeper strangeness of the pyramid lies in its numbers. The pyramid's geographic latitude is 29.979 2 degrees north. The speed of light in a vacuum, measured in kilometers per second, is 299,792. The correspondence, exact to 6 significant figures, is either the most spectacular architectural coincidence in human history or a deliberate encoding of a fundamental physical constant into the geographic placement of the most studied structure on Earth. Neither explanation sits comfortably. A coincidence of this precision across 6 decimal places challenges the boundaries of what mathematics allows coincidence to mean. A deliberate encoding implies that whoever placed the pyramid there knew the speed of light, a measurement not formally achieved by Western science until 1676. The pyramid's internal geometry adds further layers to this question. The shafts extending from the Queen's chamber point with zero margin for error to specific stars as they appeared in 2500 BCE. Orion's belt, Thuban in Draco, Sirius, not approximately, precisely. The targeting of specific celestial coordinates in an era before the telescope requires either sustained, meticulous observational astronomy over generations or access to mathematical modeling of star positions that would require knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle of 25,920 years that mainstream history does not attribute to Egyptian astronomy until centuries later. The king's chamber, meanwhile, produces standing acoustic resonances at specific low frequencies when its dimensions are measured and modeled, frequencies that modern acoustic engineering identifies as optimal for effects on human consciousness. Whether this was intentional and what it was intended for remains an open question. What makes the Great Pyramid uniquely compelling as evidence is not any single anomaly. It is the convergence. The pyramid is simultaneously a feat of physical precision that modern engineering would be proud of, an astronomical instrument of extraordinary accuracy, a geographic marker that may encode a fundamental constant of physics, and an acoustic chamber whose resonance properties have no obvious connection to funerary function. The accepted explanation that it is a tomb built by the pharaoh Khufu to house his body for eternity accounts for its existence, but not its specifications. You do not need to encode the speed of light to build a tomb. You do not need to align a coffin chamber to Orion's belt. Someone working in the desert of northern Africa 4,500 years ago knew things that the civilization they belonged to was not supposed to know. At an elevation of 3,800 meters above sea level in the Bolivian highlands, where the air is thin and the cold is bone deep, and every physical task requires twice the effort it would at sea level, there is a site that has stopped archaeologists in their tracks since it was first seriously examined by Western researchers in the 19th century. PUNKU is not conventionally spectacular. There are no soaring towers, no painted walls, no hieroglyphic inscriptions. What PUNKU offers instead is something that, in some ways, is more unsettling than any of those things. It offers precision, a level of precision in stone cutting so far beyond what any known Andean culture is documented to have possessed, that explaining it within the accepted historical framework requires a series of assumptions that the evidence at the site refuses to support. The stones at PUNKU are not simply large, though some weigh 130 metric tons. They are machined. Their surfaces are polished to a flatness that requires sustained mechanical pressure, of a kind no hand tool can generate, and their edges meet at angles so perfectly right that a precision square finds no deviation. Holes have been bored into the stone at consistent diameters and consistent depths, with no spiral drill marks on the interior surfaces, which is what any known rotary drilling process leaves behind. Most remarkably, the site contains hundreds of H-shaped interlocking blocks, each with an identical and geometrically complex profile, requiring cuts along multiple axes simultaneously. Modern machinists, I've shown photographs of these blocks without context, have consistently described the cut marks as consistent with CNC milling, computer-guided subtractive manufacturing. They were not produced that way. They could not have been. CNC milling did not exist in 500 CE. The conventional explanation for PUMA relies on the ingenuity and patience of the Tiwanaku culture, the civilization that mainstream archaeology assigns to this site. The Tiwanaku were a sophisticated people by the standards of their era, astronomically aware, hydraulically capable, socially organized. But they had no metal tools hard enough to work the red sandstone and andesite at PUMA. Andesite, in particular, is one of the hardest stones in the world. It cannot be worked with bronze or copper tools. The tools simply wear away without making meaningful progress. The stone requires steel or diamond-tipped blades, or an abrasive process of extraordinary duration and consistency. None of these were available in the Bolivian highlands in the first millennium CE, and yet the stone was cut precisely at a production quality and a scale that no available technology could have achieved. Carbon dating of organic material found beneath PUMA's foundation layer has produced dates that complicate the Tiwanaku attribution significantly, pushing the site's possible origins back to a period well before that culture's documented rise. Whether the site was built by the Tiwanaku or was already ancient when they arrived, the cutting question remains the same. What tool made these cuts? There is no academic paper, no experimental archaeology project, and no engineering study that has produced an answer that accounts for all of the observed features simultaneously. PUMA is not a mystery because nobody has studied it. It is a mystery because everyone who has studied it carefully comes to the same uncomfortable place. A place where the tools that made these cuts do not appear on any known inventory of ancient technology. Before 1994, the story of human civilization followed a sequence that archaeologists called the Neolithic Revolution. First agriculture, which enabled food surplus, then surplus, which enabled permanent settlement, then settlement, which enabled social complexity, then complexity, which eventually produced organized religion and monumental architecture. This sequence felt logical because it was logical. You cannot build a temple without people willing to stay in one place, and you cannot keep people in one place without a reliable food supply. The sequence had an internal coherence that made it feel inevitable, and it organized the entire field of prehistoric archaeology for over a century. Then a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, and the sequence fell apart. Göbekli Tepe is dated to approximately 9,600 BCE, 11,600 years ago. That number requires a moment to absorb. Stonehenge was built roughly 5,000 years ago. The Great Pyramid, 4,500 years ago. The oldest cities of ancient Mesopotamia, approximately 6,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe predates all of them by a margin that is not an archaeological footnote. It is a civilizational category shift. It is, by thousands of years, the oldest known temple complex on Earth, and it was built by people who, according to the accepted Neolithic timeline, had not yet learned to farm, who had not yet lived in permanent settlements, who were, in the conventional understanding, still hunter-gatherers without the social organization required to coordinate large-scale construction. The existence of Göbekli Tepe does not merely push the timeline back. It inverts the sequence entirely. The site consists of multiple circular enclosures, each containing T-shaped limestone pillars up to 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons. The pillars are carved with animal reliefs, foxes, boars, birds, scorpions, snakes, of a quality that implies not beginner's art, but a long tradition of skilled stone carving that left no preliminary evidence anywhere in the archaeological record. The organizational complexity alone is staggering. Quarrying, transporting, and erecting 20-ton pillars at a site with no known permanent settlement nearby requires coordinating hundreds of workers over extended periods. Workers who needed to be fed, housed, and directed by some form of social authority sophisticated enough to maintain a large construction project over years or decades. But the most haunting feature of Göbekli Tepe is not what was built there. It is what was done to it afterward. Around 8,000 BCE, roughly 1,600 years after the site's construction began, someone carefully filled the entire complex with debris, stone rubble, animal bones, soil. The fill was not the result of natural accumulation. It was deliberate, methodical, and thorough. Every enclosure was sealed. Every pillar was buried. The entire complex was interred in a man-made mound that protected and preserved it for 11,000 years, until a Kurdish shepherd stumbled across anomalous stones on a hillside and a German archaeologist began to dig. Whatever was built at Göbekli Tepe, someone with knowledge of its significance decided at some point that the future should not find it easily, and the question that excavation has never answered is the most human question of all. What were they afraid of, and who were they afraid would look? Stretched across 450 square kilometers of Peru's coastal desert, etched into a surface so dry and geologically stable that the markings have survived for 2,000 years, with almost no erosion. The Nazca lines are one of the most discussed and least satisfactorily explained creations of the ancient world. The lines themselves, some running perfectly straight for kilometers across uneven terrain without a single deviation, others forming spirals and geometric shapes of extraordinary complexity, are impressive enough. But the Nazca geoglyphs also include figurative images: a hummingbird, a condor, a spider with 8 legs and a curious appendage on one of them that matches only the reproductive organ of a specific Amazonian spider species invisible to the naked eye. A monkey with a coiled tail. See a humanoid figure standing on a hillside with oversized, rounded eyes and a form that has been called, in many languages, an astronaut. The central paradox of the Nazca lines is not a matter of interpretation, it is geometric. These images, the hummingbird with its sweeping wings, the condor with its wingspan of 130 meters, the spider in its entirety, are only coherent from the air. From the ground, they appear as shallow trenches, maybe 15 centimeters deep, and cleared of the reddish surface, pebbles to reveal the lighter yellow-grey soil beneath. From the ground, there is no mountain, no hillside, no elevation of any kind that would allow a viewer to see the full shape of any single figure. The images were made to be seen from above. The Nazca people had no aircraft. The question is not who made them. The Nazca culture's authorship is archaeologically established. And the question is the same one the geometry forces on any honest examiner. Who were they made for? The mainstream explanation that the lines were processional paths, walked as religious acts, and that their aerial coherence was spiritually rather than practically significant, has genuine merit and genuine advocates. Ceremonial paths exist in many cultures. Walking the outline of a sacred figure as a form of prayer is a documented practice. But this explanation, applied to Nazca, requires accepting that an entire culture invested enormous communal effort in constructing images whose completed form their creators could never perceive. It requires accepting that the geometrical precision of the straight lines, which maintain their bearing across ridges, valleys, and broken terrain with an accuracy that modern surveyors have verified, was achieved through dead reckoning alone, without any mechanism for verifying the line from above. It requires, in other words, in building for an audience that the builders knew somehow was there. There is one feature of the Nazca Desert that has received less attention than the lines themselves and deserves considerably more. Of all the places in the world where large geoglyphs could have been created, flat, open terrain exists on every continent. The Nazca Plateau is uniquely suited to long-term preservation. The combination of its extreme aridity, its lack of wind, its geological stability, and its specific soil chemistry means that marks made on its surface 2,000 years ago are as legible today as they were when they were new. If you wanted to leave a message that would survive for millennia, this is one of the best surfaces on Earth to leave it on. The Nazca people either chose this surface by coincidence or they understood its preservation properties. And if they understood its preservation properties, then the question about the intended audience becomes even more pointed. The lines were built to last. They were built to be seen. They are still here. Whoever they were waiting for may simply not have arrived yet. The Vedic texts of ancient India are among the oldest continuous literary tradition on Earth. The Rig Veda alone is conservatively dated to 1500 BCE, with oral traditions extending centuries earlier. A Western scholarship has always categorized these texts as religious and philosophical poetry, hymns to fire gods, creation narratives, moral philosophy. That categorization is accurate as far as it goes, but embedded within the Vedic corpus, across the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Rig Veda itself, and the more technical Vaimanika Shastra, is a strand of material that reads less like metaphysical poetry and more like engineering documentation. Descriptions of aerial vehicles, called Vimanas, are detailed enough to have generated serious academic and engineering interest in the 20th century. The Vaimanika Shastra, a text that claims to encode ancient knowledge and was transcribed in the early 20th century in India, describes aircraft in terms that include specific metals for hull construction, propulsion systems using what it calls mercury vortex engines, and methods for generating electromagnetic shielding around the craft. An aeronautical engineering study conducted at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore in 1974 concluded that several of the designs described in the text were aeronautically non-viable, but significantly they were non-viable as literal aircraft designs, not as evidence of aviation knowledge. The study's critics noted that the researchers were evaluating a text filtered through centuries of transmission and translation for direct engineering applicability, which is a category error. What the text demonstrates is familiarity with the conceptual requirements of flight, lift, propulsion, materials resistance, and crew protection. The Mahabharata's description of a weapon called the Brahmastra is worth considering separately because it has been noted not by alternative historians but by physicists. The Brahmastra, as described in the text, is a single projectile capable of destroying a city, contaminating its water and soil for years afterward, and causing children born in the affected region to be deformed. It produces heat and light exceeding that of 1,000 suns. The affected zone becomes uninhabitable for generations. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the director of the Manhattan Project, upon witnessing the first atomic test detonation at Trinity, New Mexico, in 1945, quoted not a Western text, but the Bhagavad Gita. He later, in a recorded interview, said that the Trinity test was not the first time such a weapon had been used in the history of the world. He was referring to the Mahabharata. The question the Vedic texts force is not whether ancient India had nuclear weapons or functional aircraft. The question is more precise than that. Engineering specific language, specific enough for modern researchers to build working models from Vedic descriptions of other technologies, including surgical instruments that have been verified against excavated artifacts, does not appear in religious poetry by accident. The level of technical detail in the flight descriptions, the weapons descriptions, and the metallurgical references exceeds what is required for allegory. Someone writing these texts was describing either machines they had seen, machines they had been told about by someone who had seen them, saw machines inherited from a tradition of knowledge that preceded the oldest dates we assign to any of these texts. In any of those three cases, the conversation about what ancient India knew is not yet finished. The Book of Enoch was excluded from the biblical canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, and for over 1,000 years it existed in the Western tradition as a rumor, a text mentioned by early Christian writers but unavailable for examination. Then, in 1773, Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia with 3 complete manuscripts of the book. and the exclusion was suddenly visible for what it was: a deliberate decision to remove from the sacred record a document that described things the early church found inconvenient. The text is ancient. Most scholars date its composition to between 300 and 200 BCE, but it describes events set in a time before recorded history, narrated through the perspective of Enoch, a figure mentioned briefly in Genesis as a man who walked with God and was taken up without dying. The book of Enoch describes a group of beings called the Watchers, 200 of them by the text's account, who descended to earth on the summit of Mount Hermon and took human companions. What makes the Watcher narrative remarkable is not the cosmological framework around it, but the specific list of knowledge that these beings transmitted to humanity. The Watchers taught metallurgy, specifically the art of making weapons from metal. They taught astronomy, including the movements of the sun and moon and the names and influences of the stars. They taught writing, medicine, and the chemistry of cosmetics. They taught agriculture and the interpretation of omens. They taught, in short, the foundational disciplines of what we call civilization, and they were punished for it, condemned by the divine hierarchy for sharing knowledge that humanity was not yet supposed to possess. The Watcher narrative, read not as theology, but as a knowledge transmission record, describes something structurally unusual. It is not a story of human discovery. It is a story of human reception, of knowledge arriving from outside, from beings with access to information beyond humanity's developmental stage. They're transmitted to a small group and then spreading outward. The punitive response of the divine hierarchy implies that the knowledge transfer was unauthorized, that there existed a plan for humanity's development that the Watchers violated by accelerating it. Whether one reads this as literal divine governance, as metaphor for social taboo around certain kinds of knowledge, or as a memory of actual contact with more advanced beings, the structure of the narrative is consistent across every culture that tells it, because the Watcher story is not unique to Enoch. The Sumerian Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea before the Great Flood and gave civilization to humanity, follow the same template. The Mesoamerican Quetzalcoatl arrived from the east, gave the people agriculture, calendar knowledge, and metallurgy, then departed. The Aboriginal Australian tradition of the Wangina, beings who came from the sky and taught the people the law of the land, follows the same arc. The Hindu tradition of the Devas, descending to interact with humanity. The Chinese accounts of sky beings who gave the first dynasties their ruling knowledge. Every major ancient civilization has this story. Every one of them describes external beings, sky origin, knowledge transfer, and eventual departure. The probability that all of these traditions, independently, invented the same narrative structure, in isolation, on 6 different continents, is a number that requires scientific notation to write. The Sumerian king list exists in multiple versions, inscribed on clay tablets recovered from multiple ancient sites in Mesopotamia, the most complete of which is the Weld Blundell prism, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Its opening line is among the most disorienting in the history of recorded language. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was first in the city of Eridu. From there, it catalogues the kings of Sumer, in order recording each ruler's name and the length of their reign. For the kings after the Great Flood, the event the text treats as a historical watershed, the reign lengths are recognizable. Hundreds of years, then decades, falling, eventually, into the human range we expect from ancient monarchies. But for the kings before the flood, the numbers are not of this world. Individual reigns are measured in thousands of years. The first 8 kings reigned for a combined total of 241,200 years. The standard academic response to these numbers is to classify them as mythological exaggeration, the kind of symbolic magnitude that ancient cultures often applied to legendary figures. This interpretation is reasonable. It is also incomplete. For one thing, the text does not treat the pre-flood kings as legendary in its own framing. It lists them with the same documentary precision as the post-flood monarchs, the same name-city-reign format, the same cross-references to other records. For another, there are 3 alternative readings of the numbers that are not mythological. The first is that the Sumerian unit of time recorded here is not a solar year, but a sar, a unit of 3,600 years, used in Sumerian astronomical cycles, and that some early transcriber converted sar to year without understanding the distinction, inflating the numbers by a factor of 3,600. The second is that the pre-flood year was reckoned differently, possibly as a lunar month, which reduces some of the reign lengths to biologically plausible figures, while still placing human civilization thousands of years earlier than accepted. The third reading is the most structurally interesting. The king list describes the pre-flood rulers not as mortal kings in any conventional sense, but as beings of a categorically different nature, longer lived, differently constructed, associated with sky origin and divine lineage. If the pre-flood entries are not exaggerated records of human rulers, but accurate records of non-human or transhuman entities governing early human civilization, then the length of their reigns is not an astronomical error in the text. It is the most accurate thing in the text. And the moment the flood occurs, the moment those entities exit the historical stage, the reign lengths drop suddenly, dramatically, to the scale of human lifespans. Something changed at the flood. Whatever had been managing the duration of governance on earth was gone. What replaced it was mortal, and its impermanence is written in the numbers. The king list also specifies the cities where kingship was held before the flood, and several of those cities have been identified and partially excavated. The city of Eridu, first on the list, is a real archaeological site in southern Iraq. Its excavation layers extend back to approximately 5,400 BCE, making it one of the oldest confirmed urban sites on Earth. The presence of real, verifiable cities in a list that also contains entities ruling for 28,000 years is not an argument for the literal truth of the reign lengths. It is an argument against pure mythological invention. Whoever composed the king list was working from something: records, oral traditions, inscribed stone, that contained a mixture of the verifiable and the inexplicable. The honest position is that we do not know how to read the inexplicable portions. The dishonest position is to pretend they are not there. In the conventional Egyptological reading, the dua is the Egyptian afterlife, the realm of the dead through which the soul of a deceased person must navigate after death, guided by the spells and prayers of the Book of the Dead. It is populated by gods, monsters, and challenges that the soul must survive to reach the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. Generations of scholars have read the Duat texts as funerary literature, religious consolation, moral instruction, the comforting architecture of a culture's beliefs about what happens after the body fails. That reading is legitimate and has produced important scholarship. It is also almost certainly incomplete, because the Duat, when read as navigation literature rather than poetry, describes a path through a specific region of the sky whose coordinates are encoded with an astronomical precision that funerary poetry has no business containing. In 1994, researchers Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert published work demonstrating that the three Great Pyramids of Giza, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, mirror, with remarkable positional accuracy, the three belt stars of the Orion constellation as they appeared in approximately 10,500 BCE. The angular relationship between the three pyramids and their slight offset from a perfect north-south line matches the angular relationship and slight offset of Al-Nitak, Al-Nilam, and Mintaka, Orion's belt, as computed by astronomical software, for the sky as it appeared over Egypt more than 12,000 years ago. If the pyramids are a ground map of the sky, the question follows naturally: what are they pointing to? And what do the Duat texts, which explicitly locate the afterlife in the region of Orion, actually mean when they speak of a passage through that celestial territory? The Dua is described in multiple texts as possessing 12 gates, corresponding to 12 hours. Those 12 hours, mapped onto the astronomical cycle, correspond to 12 ages of the precession of the equinoxes, the 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's rotational axis that slowly moves the observable sky through a complete circuit of the zodiac. And each precessional age lasts approximately 2,160 years, and 12 of them span the full cycle of 25,920 years. The ancient Egyptians were aware of precession. Its 25,920-year value is encoded in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid, in the Duat's 12-gate structure, and in the astronomical alignments of their sacred sites, with a precision that requires sustained, multi-generational observation over centuries at minimum. Whether the Duat is a spiritual metaphor for this astronomical cycle, or whether the astronomical cycle is the outer shell of something the Duat describes more literally, remains an open question that Egyptology has not fully examined. The possibility this section leaves with the audience is not a certainty, but a coordinate. If the Duat is a navigation text, if its 12 gates are not hours of the night, but positions in a temporal cycle spanning 26,000 years, then it encodes something that goes beyond death and rebirth in the spiritual sense. It encodes a map of time itself, a map of when, not just where. The ancient Egyptians may not have been describing a journey the soul takes after death. They may have been describing a journey, one that requires knowing the right position in the sky, the right alignment of stars, the right moment in a cycle that takes the better part of 26,000 years to complete, that leads not to a spiritual destination, but to a temporal one. If that reading has any validity at all, and then the Book of the Dead is not a poem about dying. It is a user's manual for a form of navigation that the civilization we live in has not yet developed, but may be approaching. Most people, most of the time, experience time as a river. It moves in one direction, forward, at a consistent pace, regardless of where you are, regardless of how fast you are moving, regardless of anything you might do to it. This experience of time is so universal, so fundamental to the way human consciousness is organized, that questioning it feels like questioning the ground beneath your feet. But the ground beneath your feet is not as solid as it appears. Albert Einstein's Special Theory of Relativity, published in 1905, when he was 26 years old and working as a patent clerk in Bern, dismantled the universal river in a paper that most professional physicists of the era were initially reluctant to fully accept. Time, Einstein showed, is not a universal constant. It is a dimension, the fourth, and like the three spatial dimensions, it can be warped, stretched, and compressed. The evidence for this is not confined to chalkboards and thought experiments. It is measurable with instruments. It operates in the technology you use every day. Atomic clocks flown aboard aircraft running at high altitude and high speed have been shown to tick measurably slower than identical atomic clocks remaining on the ground, a phenomenon called time dilation. The effect is small at the speeds and altitudes aircraft achieve, but it is real, verified, and fully consistent with the equations Einstein derived. GPS satellites orbit the Earth at high speed and at altitudes where Earth's gravitational field is weaker. Relativity predicts that their clocks should run faster than ground clocks, roughly 38 microseconds per day faster. If engineers did not correct for this difference every day, GPS systems would accumulate position errors of roughly 11 kilometers every 24 hours. GPS works because relativity is real. Your navigation app is running on time dilation. There is a harder and more philosophically significant implication of relativistic time that most physics education glosses over. Einstein, in correspondence with physicist Max Born, developed what became known as the block universe concept. In this framework, the universe does not flow from past to future through a moving present. Instead, all moments, past, present, and future, coexist simultaneously in a four-dimensional structure that Einstein and his collaborators called space-time. The experience of time as sequential, as a river flowing forward, is in this framework a property of consciousness, not of the universe. It is the perspective of a being embedded within the block, moving through it, perceiving each moment in succession, but the moments before and after, every moment that has existed or will exist, are as real as the moment being experienced. They are simply not accessible from the perspective of standard human consciousness. This is not a fringe interpretation. It is a serious position within the philosophy of physics, supported by the mathematics of general relativity. if all moments coexist. And then visiting the past is not a question of creating something new. It is a question of access. The past is not gone. It is simply somewhere else in the four-dimensional structure of space-time. The same way a city 500 kilometers away is not gone. It is simply not here. Getting to it requires movement, not creation. The question is not whether the past exists in some physical sense. Relativity's best evidence says it does. The question is whether any mechanism, technological, natural, or otherwise, can translate a physical body from one temporal coordinate to another. Physics has not said no. It has said the engineering is hard. In 1935, Albert Einstein and physicist Nathan Rosen published a paper describing a hypothetical structure in the geometry of space-time, a tube or bridge connecting two distant points in the four-dimensional fabric of the universe through a shortcut that bypassed the normal distance between them. The paper was mathematical in nature and describing a solution to Einstein's field equations rather than a physical proposal. The media eventually named the structure a wormhole. For decades, it remained a mathematical curiosity, interesting to theorists, but dismissed as physically irrelevant because the conditions required to create one appeared to be impossibly extreme. Then, in 1988, physicist Kip Thorne, who would later share the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on gravitational wave detection, published a paper in Physical Review Letters, concluding that traversable wormholes were theoretically permissible under general relativity. Thorne's paper began not as an independent research project, but as a favor to his friend Carl Sagan, who was writing the novel Contact, and wanted to know if a wormhole could serve as a plausible plot device for faster-than-light travel. Thorne's answer, after rigorous analysis, was yes, under specific conditions. A traversable wormhole, Thorne showed, would require a substance with negative energy density, what physicists call exotic matter, to keep its throat open and prevent it from pinching shut. Exotic matter is bizarre but not fictitious. The Casimir effect, a measurable quantum phenomenon involving two closely spaced metal plates in a vacuum, produces exactly the kind of negative energy density that wormhole stabilization requires. On a tiny scale, exotic matter has been measured in laboratories. Whether it could be manufactured or harnessed at the scale required to stabilize a traversable wormhole remains an engineering question, not a physical impossibility. The temporal dimension of wormhole theory is where the physics becomes genuinely startling. If one end of a stable wormhole could be accelerated to high velocity relative to the other, taken on a long, fast journey and brought back, time dilation would create a temporal offset between the two ends. Someone entering the stationary end of the wormhole would exit the accelerated end at a different point in time. The wormhole would function as a time machine, connecting two different temporal coordinates of the same location in space. Stephen Hawking, uncomfortable with this implication, proposed what he called the chronology protection conjecture. The idea that the laws of physics conspire to prevent closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back to the past. But Hawking was scrupulously honest about its status. It is a conjecture, not a theorem, not a proof. A conjecture is an educated position in the absence of definitive mathematics. And no definitive mathematics ruling out time travel has been produced. The broader point is this. Physics has spent over a century examining whether time travel is permitted by the laws of nature, and the honest answer from the physics literature is a carefully hedged maybe. The special theory of relativity permits it through time dilation. General relativity permits wormhole-based temporal displacement. Quantum mechanics suggests, through certain interpretations, that backward causation, cause and effect operating in both directions through time, cannot be categorically ruled out. No conservation law, no symmetry principle, no fundamental theorem of physics contains a hard prohibition on temporal displacement. The obstacles are engineering, requiring exotic matter, extreme energy, and conditions that no human technology can currently produce. But engineering obstacles are the kind that civilizations, given enough time and knowledge, eventually overcome. The question is whether any civilization, at any point in the history of this universe, has overcome them. And the question after that is whether they left any evidence. Quantum mechanics is the physics of the very small, the behavior of particles, atoms, and energy at scales far below what any human sense can directly perceive. It is also, by the consensus of the physicists who work with it daily, the most disturbing description of reality that science has ever produced. Richard Feynman, one of the great quantum physicists of the 20th century, said famously that nobody understands quantum mechanics, not because it is unsolved, but because its implications for the nature of reality are so far outside ordinary intuition that comprehension in any conventional sense may be impossible. Of all the features of quantum mechanics that disturb physicists, the one most relevant to time is quantum entanglement. Entanglement describes what happens when two particles interact in a way that links their quantum states. Once entangled, measuring the state of one particle, determining whether it is spinning up or down, whether its polarization is horizontal or vertical, instantaneously determines the corresponding state of its partner, regardless of the distance between them. The effect is not a signal traveling through space. It is faster than light. It is, according to the mathematics, instantaneous. Say Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, and spent the last decades of his career attempting to prove it was a mathematical illusion rather than a physical reality. In 1964, physicist John Bell devised a mathematical test, the Bell inequality, that could distinguish between a universe where entanglement is real and a universe where it merely appears real due to hidden variables. Decades of experiments, culminating in the 2022 Nobel Prize winning work of Alain Aspect, John Clauser, and Anton Zeilinger, confirmed definitively entanglement is real, non-local, and instantaneous. The implications for time are indirect but significant. Entanglement demonstrates that the universe contains correlations that operate outside the ordinary framework of spatially separated cause and effect. Information, if it can be called that, links two particles across any distance without traversing the space between them and without any detectable time delay. This does not immediately imply time travel, but it does imply that the assumption of strict locality and strict temporal sequence at the level of physical reality is false. The universe, at its deepest accessible level, does not obey the simple rule that cause must always precede effect, and that nothing can be correlated instantaneously across distance. Those rules are emergent features of the world at the scale humans inhabit, not fundamental features of the universe at every scale. The Wheeler-DeWitt equation, developed in the 1960s by physicists John Wheeler and Bryce DeWitt in an attempt to reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity, takes this further. The equation describes the wave function of the entire universe, the complete quantum state of all matter and energy in existence. And it does so without the variable t, the variable that represents time. At the most fundamental scale of physical description currently available to science, and time does not appear as an independent variable. It is not present in the equation that governs everything. This finding and its implications has been described by physicists as either philosophically profound or merely technically interesting, depending on how far they are willing to follow it. What it suggests, at minimum, is that sequential time, the river, the forward flow, is a feature of the scale at which consciousness operates, not a feature of physical reality at all scales. If that is true, beings or technologies operating at a different physical scale or with access to descriptions of reality below the level where time is a variable might experience the structure of events in ways that make temporal navigation not miraculous, but merely technical. In 1950, physicist Enrico Fermi was having lunch with colleagues at Los Alamos National Laboratory when the conversation turned to the probability of extraterrestrial life. The universe, Fermi noted, is approximately 13 billion years old. The Milky Way alone contains hundreds of billions of stars, a significant fraction of which host planets in habitable zones. The probability that intelligent life has arisen elsewhere, given this scale and this age, is high by almost any reasonable calculation, and civilizations that developed before ours by even a few million years, a blink in cosmic time, would have had ample opportunity to develop interstellar travel and colonize large portions of the galaxy. And yet, we detect nothing. No radio signals, no megastructures, no visitors. Where, Fermi asked, is everybody? The question became one of the most discussed in all of science, and in 70 years it has not been satisfactorily answered. The standard solutions to the Fermi paradox are numerous and well rehearsed. Perhaps intelligent life is rarer than probability suggests. Perhaps civilizations destroy themselves before developing interstellar technology. Perhaps the distances are simply too great, even for the oldest civilizations. Perhaps everyone is listening, and no one is broadcasting. Each of these solutions has advocates and evidence, but there is a solution to the Fermi paradox that has received almost no attention in mainstream scientific discussion, possibly because it requires taking temporal displacement seriously as a physical capability. What if the absence of detectable spatial visitors does not indicate an absence of visitors? What if civilizations that reach the threshold of genuine technological maturity stop exploring space and begin exploring time? A civilization that masters temporal navigation has something far more compelling than interstellar travel available to it: access to its own history. The entire past of a civilization, every moment, every resource, Every version of every event becomes accessible territory. The incentive to broadcast radio signals across light years, to launch generation ships toward distant stars, to build Dyson spheres around foreign suns, evaporates entirely if you can step backward through your own timeline and access everything your civilization has ever had. Time-traveling civilizations would be, in a very specific sense, invisible to the methods we use to look for extraterrestrial intelligence, because they would not be expanding outward through space. They would be moving inward through time. Their signature would not be radio transmissions or visible megastructures. Their signature would be anomalies in the historical record of the civilizations they visited, artifacts that should not exist, structures built to tolerances their era cannot explain, texts that describe technologies centuries before those technologies were developed, myths on every continent of beings who descended from the sky, transmitted advanced knowledge, and then departed. These are exactly the signatures that a time-traveling civilization would leave if it visited a developing human culture in the distant past. And these are exactly the anomalies that this documentary has been cataloguing since its first chapter. The Fermi paradox, in this reading, does not describe a universe empty of intelligence. It describes a universe where the most intelligent civilizations have redirected their attention from the spatial frontier to the temporal one. The silence from space may not mean no one is there. It may mean that the visitors are not coming from there at all. In the summer of 678 CE, a fleet assembled by the Umayyad Caliphate appeared off the coast of Constantinople, the greatest city in the known world. The Byzantine Empire, weakened, beleaguered, holding its ground on the edge of collapse, deployed against this fleet a weapon that the attacking sailors had never encountered and that their commanders had no preparation for: Greek fire. The substance shot from pressurized bronze siphons mounted on Byzantine warships in long, sustained arcs of burning liquid that ignited on contact with the enemy ships and continued burning as the ships sank beneath the surface of the water. Not on the surface of the water, under it. The Umayyad fleet was destroyed with a completeness that contemporary accounts describe as bordering on supernatural. Greek fire did not merely win battles, it saved civilizations. It held Constantinople, and with it much of European history for another 7 centuries. The technical specifications of Greek fire are, in every respect, extraordinary for the 7th century CE. The deployment system, a pressurized bronze tube producing a sustained directional stream of flammable liquid, requires knowledge of fluid dynamics, the design and manufacture of pressurized containment vessels, and the development of a valve mechanism capable of controlling flow under pressure. And the substance itself burned on water and was reportedly made worse by water, suggesting it contained a component that reacted exothermically with water, possibly quicklime, which releases heat when wet. It could not be extinguished by sand or soil alone. It clung to surfaces. It reignited after partial suppression. These are the properties of a multi-component incendiary system, not of any single naturally occurring substance. The formula for Greek fire was a state secret of the Byzantine Empire. held within a single family of engineers and shared with no one outside that lineage. It was never written down in recoverable form. When the family that held it died, the formula died with them sometime in the 11th or 12th century. Modern chemists have proposed candidate formulas, combinations of quicklime, naphtha, potassium nitrate, calcium phosphide, and pine resin have all been suggested, but no proposed formula has reproduced all documented properties simultaneously. Not the water-burning behavior and the pressurized projection capability and the adhesive clinging and the reignition tendency together. The complete formula has not been recovered, and 700 years of Byzantine state security ensured that no independent path to its reconstruction was left. The deeper question about Greek fire is not what it was made of, fascinating as that mystery remains. The deeper question is what it represents in the pattern of ancient technical knowledge. The Byzantines did not develop Greek fire incrementally from a long tradition of chemical engineering. It appears in the historical record suddenly attributed to a Syrian engineer named Kallinikos, who arrived in Constantinople around 672 CE, carrying the knowledge with him. Where Kallinikos got it, and who taught him the fluid dynamics, the pressurization, engineering, and the incendiary chemistry is not recorded. He arrived with the knowledge. He deployed it. It saved an empire. And then, when the family line ended, it was gone. The pattern is by now familiar. Extraordinary technical capability, attributed to a single source, fully formed at arrival, completely lost at departure, as though it were never indigenous to the civilization that possessed it, as though it were borrowed from somewhere else, and the loan eventually came due. The Pantheon in Rome has stood for nearly 2,000 years. It is the best preserved major building from classical antiquity, and its survival is not the result of unusually sheltered circumstances. Rome has been sacked, flooded, fought over, and neglected for stretches of its history. The Pantheon has simply refused to degrade in the ways that buildings are supposed to. Its unreinforced concrete dome, still the largest of its kind in the world, has survived every seismic event and every extreme weather event, every century of atmospheric chemical stress that 2 millennia of European history has produced. Modern concrete structures, the best available today, begin to show significant deterioration within 50 to 100 years. The Pantheon is 20 times older than the projected lifespan of the most durable modern construction material. The difference is not engineering, it is chemistry. The Roman concrete, called opus cementicium, is made from a combination of volcanic ash from the region around Pozzuoli, seawater, and lime. The specific ash, called pozzolana, after the region of its origin, has silica and alumina content that reacts with calcium hydroxide in a process called a pozzolanic reaction, forming a strong, dense binding compound. But what distinguishes Roman concrete from modern concrete at the molecular level is what happens to it over time. A modern Portland cement concrete forms calcium silicate hydrate crystals, brittle, stable, but susceptible to cracking under the cyclic stress of temperature change and chemical exposure. Roman concrete, when exposed to seawater, undergoes a different crystallization process, forming a mineral called tobermorite, a rare aluminous crystalline structure that grows into the concrete matrix filling micro cracks and actually strengthening the material over time. Marine structures built by Roman engineers have been found after 2,000 years of continuous ocean immersion to be structurally stronger than they were when first constructed. A paper published in 2017 in the journal American Mineralogist confirmed this mechanism through direct materials analysis of Roman harbour structures at Caesarea Maritima and other sites. The finding was not merely that Roman concrete was different, it was that it was better in the specific conditions where it matters most than anything modern materials science has produced. The tobermorite crystallization that makes Roman concrete self-repairing in salt water is a result of the specific chemical ratio of pozzolana, seawater, and lime used in the original mix. Arriving at that ratio through systematic experimentation is possible. It would require decades of testing under controlled conditions, a rigorous understanding of materials chemistry, and a scientific framework for identifying and measuring the relevant properties. Whether Roman engineers had that framework, or whether the formula was transmitted to them from a tradition that had already done the work, is a question the existing historical record does not answer. The Roman concrete mystery is one of the cleanest examples of the blueprint theory, the idea that isolated ancient civilizations received specific, complete technical knowledge rather than developing it through observable steps. There is no documented Roman tradition of materials science that led incrementally to the discovery of pozzolanic concrete. The formula appears in the historical record as a Roman practice used from the 3rd century BCE onward, with a sophistication that implies it arrived already optimized. When Rome fell and the practice was abandoned, the knowledge did not pass to the civilizations that followed. Medieval builders used inferior materials for the next 1,000 years, constructing with mortar and stone that deteriorated within centuries. The Romans built the Pantheon, the Colosseum, and their harbour walls with a formula that the modern construction industry, after 60 years of serious study, has not fully decoded or replicated in industrial-scale production. Some knowledge, it appears, does not survive the civilization that carries it. Trepanation, the surgical removal of a section of the skull bone, is the oldest confirmed surgical procedure in the human archaeological record. Evidence for it has been found on every inhabited continent, in remains dating from as far back as 7,000 years ago in the Neolithic period. A single example of prehistoric brain surgery would be remarkable. What the archaeological record actually contains is thousands of cases, spread across cultures and millennia that had no documented contact with one another, executed with tools ranging from flint blades to bronze saws to obsidian instruments of extraordinary sharpness. And across a significant proportion of these cases, the exact percentage varies by region and period, but estimates range from 20% to over 50% in some populations. The skulls show evidence of bone regrowth around the surgical opening, which means the patient survived. Surviving trepanation in the ancient world is not a trivial achievement. The modern surgical procedure requires general anesthesia, sterile instruments and environment, trained surgical staff, antiseptic wound care, and pharmacological support for the recovery period. Remove each of those elements, the anesthesia, the sterility, the pharmacology, and the predicted survival rate for brain surgery drops towards zero. The surgical site is immediately vulnerable to infection. The patient, in severe pain and without sedation, will move and resist. The bleeding from the meninges must be controlled without cauterization equipment or modern hemostatic agents. By every reasonable projection of what the ancient world could offer a brain surgery patient, the survival rates observed in the archaeological record are too high. Some patients not only survived, they survived long enough for the bone to reknit substantially, which takes months to years of continued healthy living after the initial procedure. The cut patterns visible in trepanned skulls reveal technique that compounds the mystery. The marks are not random. They are controlled, multi-pass incisions that reduce the risk of cutting through to the meninges, circular cuts performed with consistent hand pressure, evidence of deliberate reduction in speed and force as the cutting approached the final depth. This is learned behavior. This is the evidence of a surgical tradition with enough case history to have identified the specific risks of each stage of the procedure and developed techniques to mitigate them. A tradition of that quality requires time, generations of practitioners, a system of knowledge transmission, and enough surviving patients to constitute feedback on what works. In the ancient world, this is what medical schools look like. Someone was teaching this. The Paracas culture of coastal Peru adds a further dimension that moves the trepanation story from the extraordinary into the genuinely uncharted. Skulls recovered from Paracas burial sites show not only trepanation, but cranial elongation, so extreme that the resulting skulls bear little morphological resemblance to standard human cranial anatomy. The elongation, typically attributed to deliberate binding of the skull in infancy, a practice documented in several ancient cultures. In Paracas, cases involves a single parietal plate, rather than the two that normally fuse along the sagittal suture, and a cranial volume significantly larger than any known binding practice can produce. DNA analysis conducted by independent researchers on Paracas remains found mitochondrial DNA with mutations that do not correspond to any known living human population or any documented ancient population. The bone structure is different. The genetics are different. The skull are real. They sit in museums in Lima. Whatever questions they raise, they do not go away because the questions are inconvenient. In the courtyard of the Qutb Minar complex in New Delhi, there is a pillar. It stands approximately 7 meters tall, weighs close to 6 metric tons, and is composed of 98% pure wrought iron. It was erected in the 4th or 5th century CE during the reign of the Gupta dynasty, likely as a flagstaff or a dedicatory monument. Inscriptions on its surface identify it as a memorial to a king named Chandra, though historians debate which specific Gupta monarch is intended. The pillar has stood in Delhi's climate, hot summers, humid monsoons, winter nights, for roughly 1,600 years. In those 1,600 years, it has not rusted, not corroded, not developed the red-orange scale of iron oxide that any bare iron object exposed to air and moisture will begin developing within weeks under normal circumstances. And the Delhi iron pillar is to any metallurgist who encounters it without context an impossibility. The explanation for the pillar's corrosion resistance eluded Western metallurgists from the moment they encountered it in the 19th century until 2002, when researchers at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, published an analysis in the journal Current Science, identifying the mechanism. The surface of the pillar is coated with a thin but stable crystalline layer of a compound called misoite, iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate, that forms a passive protective barrier between the iron and the atmosphere. This compound does not form spontaneously on ordinary wrought iron. Its formation requires specific conditions during the forging process. The use of forge, welding with slag inclusion at controlled temperatures, combined with the specific organic materials present in the charcoal-based fire that is used to heat the iron through specific stages of the manufacturing process. The phosphorus content of the iron, higher than in modern steel, derived from the specific ore used, plays a key role in enabling the misoite layer to form and stabilize. The critical point is not that the ancient Indian metallurgists who forged the pillar discovered misoite, said they almost certainly did not have a chemical vocabulary for what they were producing. The critical point is that the specific combination of process parameters they used, the ore selection, the fuel chemistry, the temperature management, the sequencing of forge welding stages, produced the exact molecular outcome that modern chemistry, working backward from the finished product over a century of analysis, finally decoded in 2002. They did not need to understand the chemistry. They needed to follow the recipe, and the recipe in every particular was exactly right. The Delhi iron pillar is the final piece in the mosaic this chapter has been assembling. Greek fire, an incendiary formula so precise that modern chemistry cannot reproduce it from description. Roman concrete, a materials formula whose molecular mechanism modern science decoded after centuries of study. Ancient brain surgery, a technique whose survival rates imply a medical tradition, sophisticated enough to rival modern practice without any of its pharmacological infrastructure. The iron pillar, a metallurgical formula whose specific protective mechanism was not formally understood until 13 centuries after the pillar was built. Each of these technologies belongs to a different culture, a different century, a different geography, and each follows the same structural pattern: complete, inoptimized, appearing fully formed, and then lost without leaving a traceable developmental record. As if each civilization received one piece of a manual that was written somewhere else, by someone who understood all of them together. The Sumerians were the first fully urban civilization on Earth, establishing themselves in the river plains of Mesopotamia roughly 6,000 years ago, with a completeness that continues to puzzle archaeologists. Not because urban civilization is puzzling in itself, but because the Sumerian emergence shows almost none of the gradual development that the archaeological record typically reveals in the rise of complex societies, writing, administrative systems, monumental architecture, sophisticated agriculture, astronomical observation, legal codes, and urban planning appear in the Sumerian record in a relatively compressed time frame. The Sumerians themselves, in their own extensive written tradition, explained this directness without embarrassment. They had been given civilization. It had been granted to them by beings called the Anunnaki, a word that translates roughly as those who from heaven to earth came. The Sumerian cuneiform tablets that describe the Anunnaki constitute one of the largest bodies of ancient textual evidence for external intelligence intervention in human development. The Anunnaki are depicted as a society rather than a pantheon in the religious sense. They have councils, internal politics, family relationships, conflicts of interest, and a chain of command that maps more onto a governmental or corporate structure than onto the arbitrary behavior of gods in most mythological traditions. They arrived from the sky. They established cities which they organized for specific functions. They created human workers through a process the texts describe as mixing divine essence with clay to perform labor. Their lifespans dwarf those of humans. Their technology, described in various tablets, includes flying vessels, weapons of devastating power, and medical capabilities that match or exceed what modern medicine can offer. Zechariah Sitchin's translations of the Sumerian tablets, which proposed that the Anunnaki were inhabitants of a 12th planet in an elongated solar orbit called Nibiru, brought this material to global attention in the late 20th century. Mainstream Sumerologists have challenged Sitchin's translations extensively, and many of his specific claims overreach what the tablets can support. But the broader narrative, beings of non-human or superhuman capacity who arrived, engineered the creation of anatomically modern humans as a workforce, established civilization from the ground up, and eventually departed, is not Sitchin's invention. It is what the tablets say in translations that mainstream Assyriology accepts. The question is not whether the Anunnaki narrative is present in the oldest written texts on Earth. It is what kind of being the Anunnaki were. The time traveler interpretation of the Anunnaki is not the most obvious one, but it may be the most coherent. What distinguishes the Anunnaki from extraterrestrial visitors in the classical science fiction sense is how deeply terrestrial their concerns are. Their politics are Earth politics. Their conflicts are over Earth resources and Earth geography. Their interest in humanity is not the interest of a superior species visiting a primitive world. It is more intimate than that, more personal. If the Anunnaki were beings from another star system, their terrestrial entanglement is puzzling. If they were beings from another point in Earth's own timeline, a future development of human civilization that achieved temporal navigation and returned to the ancient past, their deep familiarity with Earth, its resources, its human inhabitants, and the long-term trajectory of human civilization becomes not just explicable, but expected. The visitors who feel most like Earth are the visitors who have always been here, just not yet. The Dogon people of Mali in West Africa have lived in the Hombori Tondo Plateau region for centuries, maintaining a traditional culture with an oral tradition of extraordinary richness and depth. In the 1930s, French anthropologists Marcel Griol and Germaine Dieterlen conducted extended fieldwork among the Dogon, gaining access to the tribe's senior spiritual leaders over a period of years. What those leaders shared with the researchers, astronomical knowledge encoded in ritual, mythology, and ceremonial practice, was so precise and so specific that Griol and Dieterlen spent years verifying its contents before publishing their findings in 1950. The core of what the Dogon priests described was knowledge about Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which they called Sigi Tolo, and alongside it they described a companion star. The Dogon called the companion star Po Tolo, the star of the beginning. They described it as the smallest and heaviest star that exists, a tiny, dense object, far dimmer than Sirius itself, invisible to the naked eye. They described its color as white. They described its orbital period around Sirius as 50 years. In every particular, this description matches Sirius B, a white dwarf star, the collapsed remnant of a formerly large star, whose existence Western astronomy did not visually confirm until 1862, when Alvin Graham Clark, on testing a new refracting telescope, observed it for the first time. Its orbital period is 50.1 years. It is white. It is extraordinarily dense, approximately 350,000 times denser than the Sun, and it is invisible to the naked eye under any conditions. The Dogon described it accurately, in every verifiable detail. They had no telescopes. The counter-arguments to the Dogon astronomical knowledge have been documented and examined. The most prominent, advanced by skeptic author Ian Ridpath suggests that the Dogon could have learned about Sirius B from Western missionaries or travelers in the early 20th century, before Griol's fieldwork. This hypothesis requires that specific, technical astronomical data about a white dwarf star's mass, color, orbital period, and invisibility to the unaided eye was being casually circulated by missionaries in rural Mali in the 1920s, a period when Sirius B's physical properties were still being debated in professional astronomy journals. The hypothesis also does not account for the ceremonial and ritual integration of the Sirius B knowledge, which implies a tradition of generations, not years. Ritual calendars and ceremony structures are not adopted within living memory and made to appear ancient. They are the product of slow cultural accumulation. What the Dogon case establishes, in the most conservative reading possible, is that a traditional culture in West Africa possessed specific, accurate astronomical information about a star system that required a large telescope to observe and decades of technical astronomical analysis to characterize. The Dogon did not have that telescope. They did not have that analysis framework. They say, in their own tradition, that beings who came from the Sirius system, called the Nomo, brought the knowledge to them. Whether the Nomo were extraterrestrial visitors, time-traveling future humans, or something else entirely, is a question the evidence cannot answer. What the evidence can answer, and does, is that the knowledge was real, that it was accurate, and that it was in the Dogon's possession before any conventional mechanism of transmission from Western astronomy could have placed it there. Cave art is the oldest surviving human creativity. The oldest confirmed examples, abstract red dots and hand stencils in the El Castillo cave in northern Spain, have been dated to over 40,000 years ago. The Sulawesi cave paintings in Indonesia, depicting warty pig species and hand stencils have been dated to at least 45,500 years before the present. These are not the earliest possible examples. They are simply the ones that have survived in conditions allowing modern dating techniques to work. For most of that vast timeline, the subjects of cave and rock art are predictable. Animals, hunting scenes, geometric shapes, handprints, the visual vocabulary of early human consciousness, reaching toward representation of the world it inhabited, and then scattered across that timeline, on walls from Australia to Algeria, to Italy, to India. There are figures that do not fit. The rock painting site of Kerama in the Basta district of Chhattisgarh, India, contains images that Indian archaeologist J.R. Bhagat described in 2014 as depicting alien-like figures wearing suits and holding objects that resemble weapons. The figures have round, featureless heads, structured bodies, and are depicted in postures and configurations that local archaeologists have noted do not correspond to any known mythological convention of the region. They are dated to approximately 10,000 BCE. The Tassili Najar Plateau in Algeria contains images known collectively as the round head tradition. Humanoid figures with rounded, structureless heads, oversized in proportion to the body, depicted against scenes of daily life and ritual that otherwise appear consistent with Saharan Neolithic culture. The most prominent of these figures, called by some researchers the great god of the Martians, stands in a posture of authority, its round head featureless, its body clad in what appear to be garments with horizontal structure. The Val Camonica site in the Lombardy region of Italy contains thousands of rock carvings dating from the Neolithic to the Iron Age. Among the figurative images of animals, warriors, and agricultural scenes, a subset of figures have been described by Italian researchers as wearing protective suits, structured, enclosing body coverings with what appear to be helmets or head coverings connected to the suit. In Australia, the Kimberley region contains the Wandjina figures, perhaps the most visually striking example in this category. The Wandjina are depicted in Aboriginal rock art as large-headed, white-bodied beings with enormous, dark eyes and no visible mouths. They are present throughout Aboriginal cultural tradition, described as sky beings who came in the dreaming and who continue to have influence over weather and seasons. The similarity between the Wandjina's visual appearance and the standard visual convention for extraterrestrial beings in 20th century Western popular culture is, if coincidental, extraordinarily precise. No single one of these cases is conclusive. In every instance, an alternative identification can be proposed. Round heads can be headdresses, structured bodies can be ceremonial robes, eyes without mouths can be masks. These alternative readings are honest and should be considered. But the pattern that emerges across all four cases, and dozens of additional examples from Siberia, South America, and the Sahara, is not easily accounted for by parallel artistic convention. Humans on 4 continents, across a span of 40,000 years, with no documented cultural connection to one another, chose to depict the same type of unusual figure. Rounded head, structured enclosing form, prominent eyes, non-human proportion. That convergence is either the product of a shared visual memory, an image repeated because it was real and was seen, or it is the most extraordinary coincidence in the history of art. Ancient people were drawing what they actually encountered. The question this chapter has been building toward is what they encountered, and whether, when we understand what it was, we will recognize it as something familiar. In almost every ancient culture on Earth, the earliest layers of recorded memory describe beings of enormous physical stature. The Nephilim of the Hebrew Bible, described in Genesis as giants in the earth, the offspring of divine beings and human women, appear as one of the more troubling features of a text that mainstream theology has spent centuries finding ways to read symbolically. The Titans of Greek mythology, who predate the Olympian gods and were eventually imprisoned by them, and were described as beings of superhuman size and strength. The Rephaim of Canaanite tradition were a race of giants associated with the pre-Israelite inhabitants of the Levant. In the Sumerian king lists, the pre-flood rulers are described in physical terms that imply beings of fundamentally different biology from post-flood humanity. Native American oral traditions across multiple tribes describe encounters with giant peoples who inhabited the continent in earlier ages, many of them hostile, say some of them technologically sophisticated. The consistent presence of giant beings in the foundational mythologies of disconnected ancient cultures constitutes a pattern of the same kind that this documentary has been examining throughout. Parallel reports, too specific to be generic symbolism, appearing in cultures with no documented contact across a time span too long to be explained by a single originating story. The standard academic response is that giant mythology serves a consistent cultural function. It externalizes the ancestors, making the builders of the old, impressive structures into beings larger and more powerful than ordinary humans as a way of explaining impressive achievements. This is a reasonable interpretation. It is also untestable, which is different from being proven. What the mythological record alone cannot establish, the physical record complicates. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a notable number of newspaper reports from across the United States described the discovery in burial mounds attributed to pre-Columbian populations of skeletal remains of anomalous height. Estimates in surviving accounts range from 7 to over 9 feet. Many of these reports note that the remains were transferred to the Smithsonian Institution. A 2014 internal review by the Smithsonian's own Inspector General confirmed that certain categories of archaeological material received in the 19th and early 20th centuries were archived in ways that made subsequent tracking difficult. None of the anomalous remains described in historical newspaper accounts are on public exhibition anywhere in the Smithsonian's extensive collection. The official explanation centers on organizational and documentation challenges inherent in 19th century archiving practices. The scientific record also contains a relevant data point. Gigantopithecus, a genus of great ape whose fossils have been recovered from sites in China, India, and Vietnam, was confirmed to have lived concurrently with anatomically modern humans, overlapping with Homo sapiens by at least 100,000 years. The largest estimated specimens were 3 meters in height. Gigantopithecus was not a human, and its anatomy does not map cleanly onto the humanoid descriptions in giant mythology. But its confirmed coexistence with modern humans establishes the baseline fact that hominid species of extraordinary height were present on Earth within the time range of human memory and cultural transmission. The leap from large contemporaneous hominid to giant being in mythology is not proven here. It is measured and then found to be considerably shorter than casual dismissal implies. The giants of ancient record were not invented from nothing. Something very large walked alongside humanity's earliest generations. What it was and where it went remains officially unresolved. Plato introduced Atlantis in 2 of his philosophical dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. The account is specific in ways that distinguishes it from ordinary mythological narrative. Plato names his source, Solon, the Athenian statesman who reportedly received the account from an Egyptian priest during a visit to Sais in the Nile Delta. The priest, according to Solon's account, as transmitted through Plato's family across generations, told him that the Athenians preserved in their myths a memory of events that had actually occurred, but that the Greeks, unlike the Egyptians, had lost the historical continuity that would have told them so. The Egyptians had been writing things down for longer, and they remembered what the Greeks had forgotten, and what they remembered was Atlantis. The account Plato records is specific, not in the manner of mythology, which typically deals in archetypes and moral lessons, but in the manner of historical record. Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the classical name for the Strait of Gibraltar. It was a naval empire of extraordinary power, larger than Libya and Asia combined, that controlled sea routes across much of the known world. Its civilization was sophisticated. It had legal codes, a council of kings, maritime technology, and metallurgy, involving a rare alloy called orichalcum, a reddish metal second only to gold in value, that has no obvious match in any known ancient metallurgical tradition, but whose description has been compared to a copper-gold alloy. And then, in Plato's account, approximately 9,600 years before his writing, in a single catastrophic day and night, Atlantis sank beneath the ocean. And the geological record provides context that was unavailable to scholars in Plato's time. The Younger Dryas, a period of rapid, dramatic climate disruption that began approximately 12,800 years ago, coincides within the margin of geological dating with the period Plato describes. Evidence has been accumulating, including from a peer-reviewed paper published in 2018 in the Journal of Geology by 26 co-authors, for a cosmic impact event at the onset of the Younger Dryas that triggered massive fires, glacial melt, and sea level rises across the northern hemisphere. The civilizational collapse that followed this event, the abandonment of established settlement patterns across multiple continents, the abrupt disappearance of megafaunal species, the evidence of sudden and catastrophic coastal flooding, is dated to a period that brackets Plato's time frame closely. Whether Atlantis was a continent, a large island, or a coastal civilization, overwhelmed by rising seas, something of enormous scale was lost in that window. The honest treatment of Atlantis places it in a category between verified history and complete myth. The geological evidence for catastrophic disruption at the relevant date is solid. Plato's account is suspiciously precise for pure fiction. His specificity about location, time frame, political structure, and metallurgy is not the specificity of allegory. And the Egyptian priestly tradition, which Plato cites as his ultimate source, was the custodian of the longest continuous historical record in the ancient world. If any institution in antiquity was capable of preserving accurate memory of an event 12,000 years past, it was the temple priests of Sais. Whether what they preserved was accurate in every detail, approximate in outline, or symbolic in nature, is the core of the account. A sophisticated maritime civilization catastrophically destroyed by a natural event at the end of the last ice age is a proposition that the evidence of geology neither confirms nor refutes, but no longer dismisses. At its height, the Indus Valley civilization was one of the most impressive urban cultures on Earth. Stretching across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, it encompassed more than 1,000 settlements, including the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, each home to populations estimated at tens of thousands. What made the Indus Valley remarkable was not its scale alone, but its quality. The cities were planned, not gradually accumulated, but designed. Streets ran in grids, drainage systems channeled waste away from residential areas through covered channels that medieval European cities would not match for another 2,000 years. And buildings were constructed from standardized baked bricks, following a consistent measurement system applied across hundreds of settlements separated by enormous distances. The standardization implies a centralized administrative authority of extraordinary reach and longevity. The Indus Valley writing system, a script found on seals, pottery, and small carved objects from hundreds of sites across the civilization's extent, has not been deciphered. Not for lack of effort, linguists, mathematicians, code breakers, and computational analysts have all tried for over a century. The script is real, consistent, and present in large enough quantities to support serious analysis. It simply has not yielded. Whether it represents a language related to any modern or ancient family, or a notation system rather than a phonetic language, or something else entirely, remains unknown. A civilization of this scale and sophistication produced a writing system that is, to us, completely opaque. That opacity feels like a deliberate wall rather than an accidental gap. Around 1300 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization effectively ceased. The large cities were abandoned. The standardized brick production stopped. The drainage systems fell into disrepair. The script disappeared from the archaeological record. Over the following centuries, in the region's population dispersed and the sophistication of material culture declined to levels well below what the Indus Valley had achieved. What makes this collapse distinctive in the annals of ancient civilizational endings is not its totality. Civilizations have ended completely before, but its absence of the usual explanatory signatures. There is no evidence at the major sites of invasion or conquest at the time of abandonment. No destruction layers, no burned buildings, no evidence of mass casualties from violence. there is limited evidence for epidemic disease. Climate change and the shifting of the river systems that fed the cities is the most widely accepted explanation, and it has genuine supporting evidence. But there is a detail at Mohenjo-Daro that climate and river diversion alone do not explain. Some areas of the site show evidence of extraordinary, instantaneous heat, streets of skeletal remains fallen in postures suggesting sudden death, a vitrified pottery and building material consistent with temperatures far exceeding those of any known ancient fire source, areas of fused soil that can only be produced by heat of a specific and intense kind. These features were noted by archaeologist David Davenport in the 1970s and remain among the most debated physical anomalies at the site. Mohenjo-Daro, in the local language of the region, means Mound of the Dead, a name given not by its original builders, who left no surviving language, but by whoever came after them. Whoever named it knew that death had happened there. They preserved that knowledge in a name. Whatever they knew that we do not, it was enough to mark the place with caution across centuries until someone finally dug down and found the evidence they were warning about. The Maya long count calendar is one of the most sophisticated timekeeping systems ever developed. It operates as nested cycles within cycles. Individual days, groups of 20 days, are groups of 18, 20-day periods, years, and greater cycles stacking upward in mathematical precision to track intervals spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The calendar was derived from extensive astronomical observation and requires mathematical capabilities, including the use of zero as a positional placeholder, that Western mathematics would not independently develop for over 1,000 years after the Maya were using it routinely. So when astronomers and mathematicians first fully decoded the long count in the 19th century, they found that its astronomical predictions for solar and lunar events, eclipse cycles, and planetary positions matched modern calculations with precision that would require sustained observational astronomy over centuries to achieve. The calendar's major cycle, completion on December 21st, 2012, the end of the 13th Baktun, a period of approximately 5,125 years, generated significant popular attention in the years leading up to that date. Most of it focused on a supposed prediction of world ending. The Maya made no such prediction. No Maya text describes December 21st, 2012 as a day of destruction. What the texts around the calendar's endpoint actually describe, in the Chilam Balam, in the Dresden Codex, in the oral traditions preserved by contemporary Maya scholars, is the completion of an age and the beginning of a new one. The previous world ages in Maya cosmology did not end in annihilation. They ended in transformation. The people of each previous age were changed, not destroyed. The calendar was not counting down to an ending. It was marking the boundary between one chapter of existence and another. Is the classic collapse, the systematic abandonment of major Maya cities between approximately 800 and 1000 CE, is one of the ancient world's better documented civilizational endings. Unlike the Indus Valley collapse, the Maya decline has clear contributing factors: prolonged drought, internecine warfare between competing city-states, agricultural, soil exhaustion from centuries of intensive farming. These factors are well evidenced and widely accepted. But the physical character of the major cities' abandonment contains features that the resource exhaustion model does not fully explain. At several sites, including PUNKU and Kopan, the final occupants appear to have cleared stored food, removed portable objects of value, and in some instances, carefully sealed specific structures before departing. This is not the behavior of a population in chaotic flight from environmental collapse. It is the behavior of a population following a plan. The Maya themselves, in their own preserved traditions, describe the classic collapse not as flight, but as departure, a return to the place of origin of the ancestral beings who had guided Maya civilization from its beginning. They called that place the stars, specifically the Pleiades. So the astronomical events of 2012 that the calendar marked included the alignment of the winter solstice sun with the crossing point of the Milky Way, an astronomical event that occurs once every 26,000 years due to the precession of the equinoxes. The Maya called this alignment the sacred tree. The completion of the calendar in their own cosmological understanding marked not an ending, but a reorientation, the moment at which the cycle completes. The beings who seeded the previous age return, and a new chapter is written. The calendar was not a prophecy of destruction. It was a welcome sign, and the arrivals it was written for may simply have been early. In July 1587, a group of 115 English settlers landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, to establish the first permanent English settlement in the New World. They were led by John White, a skilled artist and explorer who had visited the region 2 years earlier. The colony faced immediate challenges. Relations with local indigenous populations were complicated, and supplies were insufficient to sustain the settlement through winter. White agreed to return to England to secure resupply, leaving behind the colonists, including his own daughter and his newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. The resupply mission was supposed to take a few months. It took 3 years, delayed by the crisis of the Spanish Armada and the wartime restrictions on English shipping. When White finally returned to Roanoke in August 1590, the settlement was deserted. Not destroyed, deserted. The buildings that had been constructed were gone, but the site showed evidence of deliberate dismantling rather than attack. The timber had been removed, suggesting the wood was taken for use rather than burned or abandoned. There were no bodies, no graves, no signs of violence, no blood, no abandoned possessions. Of the 115 people who had been living there 3 years earlier, men, women, and children, including infants, there was no physical trace. Carved into a wooden post at the entrance to the former settlement was the word Croatoan. Carved into a nearby tree, the letters CRO. Croatoan was the name of a friendly indigenous tribe and the island they inhabited, approximately 50 miles to the south. White was unable to reach Croatoan Island. Storms drove his ships away, and his funding for the expedition was exhausted. Subsequent searches of the region in later years found no Roanoke survivors, no descendants identifiable as English, no evidence of assimilation into indigenous communities that has been archaeologically confirmed. The Lumbee people of North Carolina have long maintained a tradition that some of their ancestry traces to the Roanoke colonists, and genetic research has found some supporting evidence for this claim, though it remains debated. The mystery of Roanoke has attracted investigators for 4 centuries and has not produced a satisfying answer. People who were there are no longer there. The structures that marked their presence were deliberately taken apart. One word was left, nothing else. This documentary uses Roanoke not as a direct argument for time travel or supernatural disappearance. The mundane explanations of indigenous adoption and colony dissolution, though unproven, are entirely possible, but as a structural element in a larger pattern. What Roanoke shares with Göbekli Tepe's deliberate burial, the organized Maya departure, and the Indus Valley's unmarked exit is the quality of intention. In each case, the evidence suggests not accident or catastrophe, but choice. People left purposefully. Structures were managed before departure. The minimum required evidence. 1 carved word, 1 sealed temple, 1 cleared city was left behind. In each case, the destination is unrecovered. And in each case, the question that the evidence eventually forces is the same one. If you knew of somewhere else to go, not a different place, but a different when, would the departure look any different than this? On August 10th, 1901, 2 Oxford academics visited the Palace of Versailles together. Charlotte Ann Moberly was the principal of St. Hugh's College, one of the most prestigious women's colleges at Oxford, and Eleanor Jourdain was a scholar of French language and literature, who would later succeed Moberly as principal of the same institution. They were not tourists in any casual sense. They were educated, professionally accomplished women with reputations built on intellectual rigor and careful observation. They visited Versailles in the afternoon, intending to see the palace and gardens before returning to Paris. What happened in those gardens has been examined, debated, and discussed for over a century. It has not been explained. Walking through the gardens toward the Petit Trianon, the private estate of Marie Antoinette, both women noticed independently that something had changed. The atmosphere became heavy and oppressive in a way neither could initially define. The air went still, no birdsong, no wind, a silence that felt less like quiet and more like suspension. Around them, the garden began to populate with figures. Men in 18th century clothing, tricorn hats, long coats, powdered hair, went about their activities without acknowledging the 2 women. A woman sketching on a low seat wore a dress whose cut and fabric were unmistakably pre-revolutionary French. A man standing near a kiosk looked at them directly with an expression that Jourdain later described as one of the most unpleasant she had ever encountered. Not hostility, but a quality of wrongness she struggled to name. And another figure ran past them toward the Petit Trianon with an urgency that seemed to belong to a different set of events entirely. The oppressive quality lifted as suddenly as it had arrived. The garden was ordinary again. The summer sounds returned. Other 1901 visitors appeared. The uncanny figures were gone. Both women returned to their lodgings separately and independently wrote detailed accounts of the afternoon before comparing notes. When they compared, the correspondence was exact, and the same figures, the same sequence, the same atmospheric quality, the same sense of interruption and return. They subsequently published their account under pen names, titled An Adventure, and spent the following years researching the historical records of Versailles to understand what they had witnessed. Their research revealed that the garden layout they had walked through, the positions of the kiosk, the path, and the bridge corresponded not to the 1901 garden, but to the garden as it had existed in the 1780s during the period of Marie Antoinette's residence, just before the Revolution. The Moberly-Jourdan incident is one of the most carefully documented time-slip accounts in the historical record, precisely because of its sources. These were not credulous sensationalists. They were academics with professional reputations at stake, who published under pseudonyms and conducted historical research to evaluate their experience rather than simply accepting it. Skeptical explanations had been proposed: theatrical rehearsal in historical costume, contamination of memory by subsequent research, mass hallucination. Each has been examined and found wanting in specific details that both women's independent accounts preserve. The theatrical rehearsal hypothesis requires accepting that a troupe was rehearsing in period costume in a specific garden location that matched the pre-revolutionary layout, that neither woman recognized it as theatre, and that both women independently described the same figures in the same positions with the same atmospheric anomalies afterward. The probability mathematics of that convergence is not reassuring to the skeptic. Something happened at Versailles on August 10th, 1901, and the most parsimonious explanation, uncomfortable as it is that they were briefly in 1789. In October 1943, according to a body of testimony and documentation that the United States Navy has never fully addressed on the record, the destroyer escort USS Eldridge was subjected to an experimental procedure at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The official purpose of the program, if it existed as described, was to render naval vessels invisible to enemy magnetic mines and radar by generating a powerful electromagnetic field around the ship's hull. This type of work was not fantastical. Degaussing programs, which used electrical coils to reduce a ship's magnetic signature, were a genuine and documented component of World War II naval operations. The question is whether what was attempted at Philadelphia went considerably further than standard degaussing. The testimony that describes the experiment as something more than routine degaussing came initially from a man calling himself Carlos Allende, later identified as Carl M. Allen, a merchant marine seaman, who in 1956 sent a set of annotated letters to astronomer Morris K. Jessup, claiming to have witnessed the experiment from a nearby vessel. Allen's account described the Eldridge becoming invisible to the naked eye, teleporting to a location near Norfolk, Virginia, and approximately 200 miles away, and returning to Philadelphia, leaving some of its crew in states of severe psychological trauma, and, in the most disturbing accounts, physically merged with the hull of the ship. These claims are extraordinary, and they come from a source that even advocates of the experiment's reality, acknowledge, was erratic and unreliable in some of his other writings. 3 features of the record complicate straightforward dismissal. The first is the genuine existence of degaussing research programs. The scientific infrastructure for electromagnetic ship experiments existed in 1943, and the personnel with relevant expertise, including researchers associated with Nikola Tesla's theoretical work on electromagnetic field manipulation, were accessible to Navy projects of this period. Tesla died in January 1943, months before the alleged experiment. Those who worked adjacent to Tesla's later research have described his theoretical positions on electromagnetic field effects and spatial distortion as more advanced than his published work indicated. The second complicating factor is the Navy's response to specific document requests about the Eldridge over the decades. Neither the categorical denial of a specific event nor the clear provision of conflicting documentation, but a pattern of incomplete responses. The third is that the ship's declog for the specific dates in question contains anomalies that naval records historians have noted without resolving. The Philadelphia experiment, regardless of its ultimate truth, serves this documentary's argument in a structural sense. If a wartime government, with access to the most advanced physical theorists of the era, operating in conditions of secrecy and without restriction of budget or ethical oversight, and wished to develop electromagnetic technology for spatial and temporal displacement, the 1940s is exactly when the theoretical foundations were available and the institutional conditions were present. Whether it succeeded, failed, or was never attempted is secondary to the point. The point is that by mid-20th century, the physics of temporal displacement was sufficiently developed that serious researchers, Tesla, Einstein, Rosen, were working with the mathematical framework it requires. The gap between having the theory and having the technology is large but not infinite, and the gap between classified military research and public knowledge is historically very large indeed. The Bermuda Triangle does not, in the strict actuarial sense, claim ships and aircraft at a statistically higher rate than other equally busy ocean regions. Lloyd's of London does not charge elevated insurance premiums for transit through the area. The United States Coast Guard's official position is that the Triangle's disappearance record is consistent with its traffic volume. These are facts, and they are stated here at the outset because intellectual honesty requires acknowledging them. What they do not explain is the specific character of certain disappearances within the Triangle. Not merely that ships and aircraft have been lost there, but the quality of those losses. No wreckage, no distress signals, no bodies, vanishing at cruising altitude in clear weather. These features recur in the Triangle cases that remain genuinely unexplained after careful investigation. Flight 19, the training flight of 5 Navy TBM Avenger torpedo bombers that departed Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station on December 5, 1945, is the Triangle's most extensively documented case. All 5 aircraft vanished, along with their crew of 14 men, during an afternoon training exercise in clear weather over the Bahamas. The flight leader's radio communications, partially recovered before transmission ceased, describe compass malfunctions, disorientation, and the inability to identify any landmarks despite the aircraft being over familiar waters. A search and rescue PBM Mariner aircraft dispatched to find them also vanished, along with its crew of 13, shortly after takeoff. No wreckage from any of the 6 aircraft was ever recovered, despite extensive searches spanning weeks. The official Navy inquiry concluded that the flight leader may have been confused about his position and attributed the loss to a navigational error. It did not explain the disappearance of the rescue aircraft or the total absence of debris. In 1970, an experienced pilot named Bruce Jernan departed Andros Island in the Bahamas in a Beechcraft Bonanza, heading for Palm Beach, Florida. Over the triangle, he encountered an unusual cloud formation. Not a storm, but a localized, rotating tunnel of dense cloud open at the center, through which he flew for approximately 27 seconds. When he exited the cloud, his magnetic compass was spinning freely. Electronic fog surrounded the aircraft. Then the fog cleared, and below him was Miami Beach. He had covered the distance from Andros to Miami, a trip that should have taken 75 minutes at his aircraft's speed in 47 minutes. His fuel consumption confirmed the 47-minute flight time. FAA radar tracking, and which Jernan subsequently obtained, confirmed his arrival position. 28 minutes were absent from his instruments, his fuel, and any recoverable record of his transit. He did not experience those 28 minutes. They simply did not occur in any instrument measurable sense. The Jernan case is not unique in the Triangle's record, but it is the most carefully documented, the most instrument verifiable, and the most credibly attested. Jernan was an experienced pilot with a clean record who subsequently wrote a book and cooperated with researchers and investigators over decades. The methane hydrate hypothesis, that natural seafloor gas eruptions in the Triangle region can rapidly reduce water density enough to sink ships, is scientifically plausible and may account for some of the non-recoverable ship losses. It does not account for aircraft disappearances in clear weather, for missing time on verified instrument records, or for a pilot arriving 100 miles ahead of his calculated position. Whatever the Bermuda Triangle is, anomalous geography, natural, electromagnetic phenomenon, or something that does not yet have a name in the physical sciences, the honest answer is that the most specific cases have not been explained, and the specific cases are the ones that matter. The term Mandela effect was coined in 2010 by paranormal researcher Fiona Broome, who discovered, while speaking at a conference, that she was not alone in a specific false memory. The vivid, confident recollection that Nelson Mandela had died in prison in the 1980s. In reality, Mandela was released from Victor Verster prison in February 1990, went on to become president of South Africa, and died of a respiratory infection in December 2013. The 1980s death memory was false, but it was not Broome's alone. She found, on inquiry, that many others shared it in identical detail, including memories of news coverage and a speech by Winnie Mandela. The phenomenon rapidly expanded across the internet as people began comparing notes. The examples multiplied. The Monopoly character, rich Uncle Pennybags, no monocle, never has had one, but thousands of people remember the monocle with specificity. The Looney Tunes logo, spelled tunes, not tunes, but many remember the second spelling with equal certainty. The Berenstain Bears, Berenstain with an A, but a statistically remarkable number of readers recall Berenstain with an E. Psychology has a well-developed explanation for false memory, and it is a good one. Human memory is not a recording device. It is a reconstructive process. The brain assembles recalled information from stored fragments, and in doing so, it fills gaps with plausible material derived from context, expectation, and cultural priming. Mandela's imprisonment was so dominant a fact of 1980s geopolitical consciousness that the brain, when attempting to reconstruct a memory of his fate, may have defaulted to the culturally expected conclusion: death in captivity rather than the actual one. This is a well-evidenced mechanism of memory error. It is also not a complete explanation for the Mandela effect, because the mechanism of individual reconstruction does not explain the specificity of convergence across populations with no shared cultural context. Two people who have never met, living on different continents, reconstructing the same specific false memory in the same identical detail, is a convergence that the individual reconstruction model struggles to accommodate. The more philosophically interesting category of Mandela effect cases involves not spellings or logos, but events, and people who remember specific news events, interviews, historical moments, sequences of occurrences that differ in detail from the documented record, not vaguely, with specificity that implies a memory of something that actually happened in some version of events. The conventional explanation for this category is the same: reconstructive error, cultural contamination, confabulation. The unconventional explanation, which this documentary does not endorse, but presents as a structurally coherent hypothesis, is that some Mandela effect memories are not false memories of the timeline that exists. They are accurate memories of a timeline that was altered. If temporal manipulation has occurred, if a sufficiently advanced technology or civilization has at any point modified events in the past, then the human beings living in the modified timeline would have no conscious access to the pre-modification version of events. The modification would be total, from their perspective, as if the previous version had never existed. But memory, particularly consolidated, long-term memory involving strong emotional encoding, may not be immediately or perfectly overwritten by a temporal modification. Some neural configurations in some people might retain traces of the version of events that no longer exists in the physical record. Those people would experience their accurate memory of an altered event as a false memory of the current timeline. They would be told they are misremembering. In a universe where the timeline has been modified, they would, in one specific sense, be the only ones remembering correctly. Whether this is what the Mandela effect represents is not provable from available evidence, but it is precisely what you would expect to find if the evidence from the previous 9 chapters is pointing somewhere real. Step back for a moment from the individual details. Forget, just briefly, the specific voltage of the Baghdad battery, and the specific orbital period of Sirius B, and the specific geographic latitude of the Great Pyramid. Look instead at the architecture, the underlying structure that connects these things across the 9 chapters that preceded this one. What that structure reveals is not a collection of anomalies. It is a pattern, and patterns in science and in history are not decorative. Patterns are the fingerprints of causation. They are evidence not of what happened in any single case, but of a mechanism operating across all of them. The first pattern is simultaneous precision across disconnected cultures. The mathematical encoding in the Great Pyramid, the astronomical knowledge of the Dogon, the aerodynamic correctness of the Colombian gold figurines, the metallurgical precision of the Delhi iron pillar. These are not developments of a single civilization trading knowledge along established routes. They appear in cultures separated by oceans and centuries, with no documented mechanism of exchange. The precision in each case exceeds what the culture's general technological level would predict. It is not distributed randomly. It is clustered in specific domains: astronomy and mathematics, metallurgy, biology, and engineering, as if for whatever knowledge was distributed selectively to specific cultural groups in specific disciplines. The second pattern is universal attribution to external origin. This is not a feature of one mythology or two. Every ancient civilization on Earth, without exception, attributes its foundational knowledge not to human ingenuity, but to beings who arrived from outside the human community, from the sky, from the sea, from a realm adjacent to the ordinary world. The Anunnaki, the Nommo, the Watchers, the Apkallu, the Viracocha, the Quetzalcoatl, the Wandjina. Different names, different regional details, identical structural narrative. External beings brought the knowledge. They stayed for a time. They left. The civilizations they seeded recorded their gratitude in stone and myth and clay. And this level of cross-cultural narrative convergence does not have a satisfying explanation within the framework of parallel mythological invention. The third pattern is abrupt and total loss. The formula for Greek fire vanished with a family. The Roman concrete formula outlasted the engineers who knew it and did not survive as a transferable tradition. The ANTIKYTHERA mechanisms, engineering lineage, left no descendants. The Indus Valley writing system has no decipherable relatives. Advanced knowledge across multiple cultures and multiple domains tends to disappear not gradually, which is how knowledge normally erodes, but completely at a specific moment without leaving a developmental residue. Normal civilizational decay produces fragments, approximations, degraded versions of what was known. These technologies vanish as if they were recalled rather than forgotten, as if someone took them back. The fourth pattern is the promise of return. In every major ancient culture that describes external visitors also preserves in its tradition a prediction or promise that those visitors will return. The Maya calendar marks a date of completion that is also a date of arrival. The Egyptian duat navigates a return passage through the celestial cycle. The Book of Enoch's watchers are bound and imprisoned, but not destroyed. Their story is unfinished. The Sumerian tablets speak of the Anunnaki's departure as temporary. The Aboriginal Wandjina are not gone. They are resting, and the ceremonies that maintain their goodwill are still performed. Whatever left in all of these traditions has not left permanently. It has gone somewhere or somewhen that allows for eventual return. These 5 patterns, assembled together in one place for the first time, describe not isolated historical curiosities, but a repeating, distributed, cross-temporal event of a kind that no conventional historical category contains. And something happened. It happened more than once. It was the same thing each time, and it may not be finished. Every serious investigation, at some point, must stop collecting evidence and start building explanations. This is that moment. The evidence assembled across 10 chapters of this documentary is real, verifiable, and distributed across enough independent disciplines. Archaeology, physics, mythology, metallurgy, genetics, astronomy, and documented human experience to constitute a body of data rather than a collection of curiosities. 3 theoretical frameworks account for all of it. Not some, not most, all. Each has different implications, different strengths, different uncomfortable edges. The audience is owed all 3, presented with equal rigor, without the documentary having the dishonesty to pretend it is neutral when it has spent 10 chapters building toward the 3rd. The first is the lost civilization hypothesis. Somewhere between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, before the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe, before the Ice Age floods that raised sea levels by 120 meters and submerged enormous coastal territories, there existed a human civilization of extraordinary sophistication. Not extraterrestrial, not supernatural, human in every meaningful sense, but older than the timeline we were taught by thousands of years. When the catastrophe came, the impact event, the floods, the collapse of the ice sheets, that civilization was largely destroyed. A small number of survivors dispersed across the globe, carrying fragments of the civilization's knowledge. In Egypt, they became priests, encoding their mathematics in pyramids. In India, they became teachers, encoding their technology in sacred texts. In Bolivia, they built PUMA and moved on. In every culture they touched, the locals called them gods, because the gap between their knowledge and the surrounding culture was vast enough to require no other word. This theory is elegant, human scale, and supported by increasing geological evidence for the catastrophic events of the relevant period. The second is the external intelligence hypothesis. The visitors were not from Earth's past, they were from elsewhere. Whether that elsewhere is another star system, another dimension, or some plane of existence that human conceptual frameworks do not yet have adequate vocabulary for. The core claim is that intelligence of non-human origin has made contact with developing human civilizations at multiple points in history. The Dogon's serious knowledge, the cave paintings that depict figures no human tradition would independently invent, the genetic anomalies of the Paraka skulls, the universal sky-being mythology, these point toward contact with something that arrived from a direction other than the human developmental trajectory. This theory has the advantage of accounting for the most extreme biological anomalies in the archaeological record, including the Paraka's mitochondrial DNA, which the lost civilization hypothesis must explain as a human variant rather than a non-human presence. The third theory is the one this documentary is named for, the temporal visitor hypothesis. The visitors were not from another world. They were not from an earlier human civilization, though one may have existed. They were from our future, a version of human civilization, separated from ours by an unknown number of millennia, but recognizable as descended from the same species, the same Earth, the same evolutionary line, achieved what the physics of chapters 5 demonstrates is not prohibited: mastery of temporal navigation. Armed with that mastery, so they returned, not to our present, which would be visible to us, but to our past, to the formative periods of the cultures whose trajectory they understood from their own history. They arrived among the Sumerians and became the Anunnaki. They arrived among the Egyptians and became the gods who built in stone. They arrived among the Maya and became the sky beings who gave them their extraordinary calendar. They look human in every ancient account, because they are human. They are us, from a future we have not reached. And the reason every ancient culture's tradition of sky beings ends with a promise of return is that, from the perspective of the visitors, they have already planned it. The loop is not a mystery, it is a schedule. The evidence in this documentary is not secret. The Baghdad battery is in the Iraq Museum. The ANTIKYTHERA mechanism is in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The Paracas skulls are in the Paracas History Museum in Peru. The GÖBEKLI TEPE site is actively being excavated by a consortium of German and Turkish universities. The Orion correlation theory was published in the journal Nature. The Bell inequality experiments that confirmed quantum entanglement won the Nobel Prize. None of this material is classified, suppressed, or withheld. It is available to anyone with a library card, a browser, and the willingness to cross-reference across disciplines that rarely talk to each other. And the question this chapter asks is not why the evidence is hidden. It is not. The question is why, given its availability, it is not part of the mainstream conversation about human history. The first structural explanation is academic incentive architecture. The professional world of archaeology, Egyptology, physics, and mythology operates through peer review, tenure, and grant funding, systems that are extraordinarily effective at advancing knowledge within established frameworks and extraordinarily resistant to challenges that would require rewriting those frameworks. An Egyptologist who publicly proposed that the Great Pyramid was built with knowledge borrowed from a temporally displaced future, civilization would not be invited to the next conference. Their grant applications would be reviewed with heightened skepticism, saw the career consequences of heterodox claims in academic disciplines are severe and immediate. This is not malice. It is institutional risk management, operating exactly as designed. The institutions protect their frameworks. The frameworks are wrong, in part, but the institutions are not lying. They are simply optimized for internal consistency rather than external truth. The second structural explanation is the interdependency of the historical model, as if the accepted chronology of human civilization is significantly wrong. If Egypt received knowledge from an external source, if the Indus Valley represents a technological sophistication that predates its supposed origins, the consequences do not stop at Egyptology. Every field that used Egypt as a chronological anchor point is affected. Every museum, taxonomy that organizes human development along the standard timeline requires revision. Textbook contracts, university curricula, our museum funding models, and the public intellectual careers of hundreds of scholars rest on the accepted framework being substantially correct. Revising it is not one department's problem. It is everyone's problem simultaneously. The resistance to revision is not a cover-up. It is an organizational immune response. The third explanation is the one that this documentary presents without endorsing as factual, but finds structurally interesting. If temporal navigation becomes technically feasible in the near future, and the physics surveyed in Chapter 5 suggests the theoretical framework is available even if the engineering is not, the implications for historical interpretation would be seismic. Who has the authority to define human history if the beings who shaped it are, in some sense, our own descendants? What does national sovereignty mean if a future civilization has been operating in the human past without consent? And these are not questions any current government, academic institution, or international body is equipped to answer. It is possible, not certain, but possible, that the conversation about temporal mechanics is being deliberately deferred, not to deceive the public, but to wait for the moment when the scientific and philosophical infrastructure exists to contain the answer without causing harm. The hidden hand in that reading is not hiding a crime. It is managing the timing of a disclosure too large to be absorbed without preparation. Whether that preparation is being made and whether it will arrive before the evidence makes the conversation unavoidable is a question that this documentary leaves quite deliberately open. Return for a moment to Baghdad. A clay jar excavated in 1936, lined with copper, fitted with an iron rod. Someone made it. Someone filled it with acid, watched the needle of a galvanometer they did not have deflect, and felt the faint tingle of current they could not have named, and understood something about the invisible relationship between metal and liquid, and the invisible force that moved between them. That person lived in a world where that knowledge had no theoretical framework, no cultural context, no educational lineage to be placed within. They knew it anyway. Then they died, and the knowledge died with them, or very nearly, leaving only the jar as its sole surviving testimony. What that person knew, and how they came to know it, is the question this documentary has been asking since its first frame. Now add the ANTIKYTHERA mechanism sitting at the bottom of the Aegean for 1700 years before anyone pulled it up. Add the Great Pyramid's coordinates, encoding the speed of light in a desert in Egypt. Add the Dogon's white dwarf star, the Nazca lines visible only from altitude, the trepanned skulls of people who should not have survived their surgery, the carved cave walls of beings in structured suits, the Sanskrit passages describing nuclear detonations, the Sumerian tablets recording rain lengths in SARS. Add Roanoke and Versailles in 1901 and 28 minutes of missing time on an FAA radar screen over the Bermuda Triangle. Assemble them together. not as individual curiosities, each with its own local explanation and its own quiet corner of academic doubt. Assemble them as what they are, a body of evidence, distributed across human history, pointing in a direction that our current civilization has not yet been willing to face directly. If the temporal visitor hypothesis is correct, if some form of technologically advanced, future-descended human civilization has been seeding knowledge into the ancient past, then a specific and vertiginous implication follows. The civilization we live in right now is not the product of our own independent ingenuity. It is an inheritance received from minds operating at a vantage point we have not reached. The mathematics in our textbooks traces back, along lines we can partially follow, to knowledge that arrived in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt from a source those cultures described as divine. The engineering principles underlying our modern infrastructure echo, in certain specific and puzzling ways, the precision of structures built thousands of years before we understand such precision to have been available. We did not start from zero. We started from a gift. And the question that follows, the final question, the one that makes the others feel small, is whether we are now approaching the moment when we become the ones giving it. The loop, if it exists, closes here, somewhere in the future of the civilization you are part of, a future separated from this moment by an interval that might be centuries or might be millennia. A technology is developed that allows the navigation of time, and the people who develop it understand human history differently than we do, because they can read it from outside its linear sequence. They can see the points where development was slow, where knowledge was lost, where a small intervention in the right place at the right time could prevent a catastrophe or accelerate a breakthrough. And so they go. They carry their knowledge backward into the ancient world. They arrive among the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the Vedic scholars and the Maya, and they are understood as gods because there is no other word available. They teach what they can. They leave what they can. And then they go as every tradition promises, because the loop requires that they return to wherever they came from in order for the future they left to continue existing. The clay jar in Baghdad, the ANTIKYTHERA mechanism, the coordinates of the Great Pyramid, these are not mysteries left behind by the past. They are messages left behind by the future. And somewhere in what we are building right now, in the physics papers being written, in the quantum computers being assembled, in the theoretical frameworks being constructed for the manipulation of space-time, the message we will one day send is already being written. We have been here before, we are here again, and the loop, patient and infinite, is waiting for us to close it.